Hey guys, tonight we're unlocking a part of history that's often whispered about but rarely explored in full: sex, sin, and everything sweaty and confusing in the Middle Ages. You're lying in bed, the lights are low, and maybe you're picturing a castle, tall towers, ivy-covered stone, and somewhere behind an iron gate, a woman in a flowing linen shift locking a strange contraption around her hips. Or is she? Because here's the thing, not everything about medieval sex is as kinky or cruel as the rumors suggest, but some of it is worse. You're about to find out just how much effort went into controlling, shaming, redirecting, and occasionally indulging in physical pleasure during a time when salvation hung in the balance. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere unexpected, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where history travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through a candlelit stone corridor. The air smells like old wax and damp wool. Behind one thick wooden door, a priest is preaching about the evils of lust. Behind another, a young noblewoman is being sewn into her wedding dress, praying her new husband is kind and not covered in boils. And behind a third, well, that's where the rumor starts, the infamous chastity belt. You've probably seen one in a museum: iron underwear, padlocked in front, with suspicious holes for bodily functions. It looks barbaric, ridiculous, and heavy enough to ruin your lower back forever. But here's a bedtime truth bomb: most historians now believe that chastity belts weren't actually a widespread thing in the Middle Ages. Shocking, right? Turns out, they were more likely Renaissance-era gags, later turned into 19th-century museum curiosities to prove how backward medieval people were. There's very little medieval writing or artwork that seriously describes them being used, and none of it confirms women were forced to wear these devices for extended periods. Some belts found in museums were even made in the 1800s, for laughs. Or horror. Or both. Still, the idea of the chastity belt tells you something real: medieval people were obsessed with controlling sexuality, especially female sexuality. Whether or not they used metal devices, they absolutely used fear, religion, and surveillance to keep people's trousers laced, at least in theory. Which brings us to the soundscape of the time: church bells. You heard them in the morning, calling you to Mass. You heard them at noon, when the town paused for a prayer. You heard them at night, warning you to get indoors before curfew. But most of all, you heard them in your head, ringing with guilt every time you had a dream that featured Brother Thomas chopping wood shirtless, because the church wasn't just a building. It was a moral enforcer, a sexual regulator, and the nosiest neighbor in history. From the pulpit to the confessional, priests warned that even thinking lustful thoughts could drag your soul toward damnation. They cited saints who plucked out their eyes rather than look at a woman too long. They told stories of girls who took a vow of virginity and were rewarded with visions and miracles, and others who sinned once and were swallowed by the earth. Subtle, the Virgin Mary was upheld as the ultimate female model: pure, obedient, and eternally untouched. Eve, on the other hand, was blamed for everything from original sin to menstrual cramps. If you were a woman, you were either a Mary or an Eve. Nothing in between. No pressure, and if you were a man, you were told to resist, repress, confess, repeat. Marriage was one legal outlet for sex. But even then, it was expected to be functional, not fun. Church teachings were clear: intimacy was for making babies. If you enjoyed it too much, that was a sin too. Yes, enthusiastic procreation was suspicious. Married couples were expected to abstain during Lent, Advent, holy days, Fridays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays, basically anytime someone important might be watching from heaven. Historians still debate how strictly this was followed, but imagine going 3 months without touching your spouse, while also sleeping in the same lice-filled straw bed. Monastic monks tracked off-limits days on calendars, which sometimes covered a third of the year, so what did people actually do? Well, like any society obsessed with repression, they found loopholes. Secret liaisons. Silent gestures. Poetry. A glance that lingered a second too long over a communion wafer. Humans are creative when you give them rules. For instance, in medieval love letters, yes, those existed, writers used coded language to describe their feelings. I long to pluck the flower of your virtue was less about gardening and more about a desperate guy trying to set up a discreet rendezvous behind the stables. Even in religious communities, desires surfaced. There are records of nuns writing to each other in deeply affectionate, sometimes borderline erotic language, though whether this was emotional or physical intimacy is still up for debate. One surviving letter literally says, "I place you in my bosom, in that secret place where you alone dwell." Just picture that written in Latin, on vellum, with a quill. Now, back to the rest of society. You might assume peasants didn't have time for such things. After all, they were plowing fields from sunrise to sunset, dodging plagues, and boiling cabbage. But love, and lust, bloomed even in muddy boots. More on that later. Let's take a moment to peek into a medieval sermon. You're standing at the back of a packed stone chapel. The priest's voice echoes off the damp walls. He's describing hellfire in graphic detail, burning skin, worms that never die, and the pain of eternal desire unmet. He points at the young people. "You, yes you with the good hair," he says. "Keep your hands folded and your eyes low. Your thoughts are not your own, they are temptations. Demons lie in wait under your pillow, and yet, there's a sly grin on the face of the boy 2 rows ahead of you. Because despite everything, despite the fear and the fire and the sermons, desire doesn't care." And neither did a surprising number of medieval people. Records show couples being fined for premarital sex, but also that those fines were rarely ruinous. If you got caught, you paid up, maybe stood in the town square holding a candle in shame, and then you moved on. The church thundered against lust, but the community often shrugged and said, they're young. Let's talk virginity for a moment. It wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a commodity, especially for women. A girl's worth could be tied directly to whether she was untouched, a status sometimes proven by absurd, and biologically inaccurate, standards. Some believed the hymen was a visible seal, others swore by bleeding on the wedding night as proof of purity. There are whole grim poems about bloodied sheets, yet, beneath that anxiety was a deeper fear, about paternity. In a world without DNA tests, a man's entire legacy depended on being certain the children were his. Hence, the obsession with locking things down. Not literally with belts, perhaps, but with surveillance, social control, and a constant echo of warning bells. Meanwhile, some stories slipped through the cracks. Take the troubadours, traveling musicians who sang of forbidden love, stolen kisses, and aching longing. Their songs tell you that passion didn't disappear, it just went underground, wrapped in metaphor and melody. One famous song talks about a knight sneaking into his lady's chamber. While the rest of the castle sleeps, drawn by the flame of her candle, lit just for him. Historians still argue whether that candle meant literal light or something steamier, and here's one for the trivia books. Some medieval moralists genuinely believed that sex could influence the baby's personality. Having intercourse on a saint's day might result in a pious child. Doing it during a thunderstorm, risky, might create a moody one. There's even a fringe belief that certain positions produced boys or girls. Again, don't test this. In all of this, you start to realize, medieval sex wasn't just about the act. It was about fear, hope, duty, control. It was lit by candles, whispered in Latin, and smothered by shame, then suddenly sparked by a poem, a song, a glimpse of ankle on washing day. You lie there, the fictional chastity belt loosening in your imagination. You picture the bells ringing, not just to call you to prayer, but to cover the noise of a creaking floorboard, a stolen hour behind a tapestry, a glance across a crowded feast that says, "Meet me when the candles burn low," and just like that, the myths melt away, and you begin to see the Middle Ages not as a gray, sexless void, but as a world pulsing quietly with longing, caged, yes, but never completely contained. You blink, and now you're in a different room, still stone walls, still flickering candlelight, but the scent here is sweeter. Fresh rushes on the floor, maybe some lavender tucked in the corners. A fire smolders low in the hearth. And behind a carved wooden screen, a four-poster bed waits with curtains drawn, not just for privacy, but to keep out the cold. You're in the marriage chamber of a minor nobleman and his new bride. They're both young. He's nervous. She's a little terrified. And somewhere below, the castle steward is waiting to remove the sheets and check for blood. Romance? Not exactly. But this is what passed for tradition. In noble households, sex wasn't a private matter. Not really. Marriage was an alliance, often arranged when the bride was still a child. The age of consent under church law was 12 for girls, 14 for boys, though marriages often waited until puberty or, if you were lucky, slightly after. And while consummation might not happen immediately, there was a clear expectation: get heirs, and do it fast. The ceremony itself sometimes included a bedding ritual, where witnesses, family, servants, even clergy, led the couple to the bedroom, prayed over them, and tucked them into bed. In some parts of Europe, guests would watch until the curtains closed. No pressure, and then, the awkward part, two people, possibly strangers, fumbling through the most intimate act of their lives. With half the household listening behind the door. This wasn't about passion, it was a duty, a contract sealed not just with words but with skin. Some lords took pride in being man enough to perform on their wedding night. Others drank heavily and hoped for the best. Let's pause and talk about the decor. Noble bedrooms weren't exactly sexy by modern standards, unless you're turned on by drafty stone and creaking beams. But the tapestries? Now those got creative. Medieval bedroom wall hangings were often full of symbolism: rabbits, fertility, birds, love, pomegranates, life, and, more cheekily, little scenes of couples embracing under trees or beside fountains. Some were subtle. Others weren't. One surviving tapestry shows a woman holding a unicorn's horn, and let's just say nobody thinks that was innocent. Even illuminated manuscripts, those delicately painted books made by monks and scribes, sometimes slipped in erotic marginalia, tiny drawings of people mooning each other, or, in one case, a knight fighting a giant phallus with a sword. Historians still chuckle about that one, but while the nobles had access to poetry, perfume, and imported silk sheets, if they were very wealthy, not everything was roses and romance. Marital rape wasn't legally recognized, and wives were expected to submit. The church taught that denying your husband his marital rights could be a sin. You belonged to him, body and soul. Still, not all noble marriages were cold. Some couples did fall in love, eventually. There are letters from husbands expressing genuine tenderness, even longing. One French nobleman wrote to his wife in the 14th century, "You are the sunshine of my heart, and I think of you every hour." Sweet. Until you find out he also had two mistresses and was likely writing from another woman's bed. Let's talk about those mistresses. A powerful lord was expected to have at least one. It was almost part of the job. Kings had entire courts of favorites, many of whom were rewarded with land, titles, and extremely elaborate gifts. Jewelry, horses, castles, even poems written in their honor and performed before the Queen. Awkward, take King Edward III of England. His long-suffering queen, Philippa, knew all about his affair with Alice Purrs, a lady-in-waiting who ended up amassing great power and wealth. Court gossip said she wore Queen Philippa's jewelry and even spoke on the king's behalf in Parliament. Subtlety. Not really a medieval strength, still, there were boundaries. Public scandal was dangerous. A noblewoman caught in adultery could be banished, imprisoned, or worse. Even unproven accusations could ruin her. Remember, her value rested on her honor. Men could sin and swagger about it. Women were punished just for looking the wrong way. One fascinating case comes from the 12th century, involving Eleanor of Aquitaine, a queen, crusader, and certified historical badass. Before becoming Queen of England, she was married to the King of France, Louis VII. Their marriage was famously unromantic. She was lively, sharp-tongued, and politically savvy. He was a monkish type who spent more time praying than playing. After a frustrating stint on the Second Crusade, where rumors flew about her alleged closeness with her uncle, scandalous, Eleanor had the marriage annulled. The reason? Consanguinity, or being too closely related. But everyone knew the real problem: they couldn't stand each other. 2 months later, she married Henry Plantagenet. And let's just say that union was much more passionate, for better and worse. Now, what happened when things went wrong? Well, annulments were hard to get unless you had serious pull. So couples lived in bitter silence. Or one partner took a lover. Or, occasionally, murder. There's a real case from 1387 in France where a noblewoman poisoned her husband's food for weeks. Why? Extreme boredom, the records say. Also, he was cruel. She was eventually caught and imprisoned, but the trial notes describe a woman who looked on her own hands as though they had been someone else's. Historians still argue whether she was a victim or a villain. Let's rewind to the wedding night again, specifically, the moment after. In some regions, servants were sent in to check for blood. This wasn't just grotesque curiosity, it was legal evidence. If the bride bled, it proved she was a virgin. If not, well, expect an awkward conversation over breakfast. Of course, biology being what it is, not all women bled, and some who did weren't virgins. But logic rarely stood in the way of ritual. In one weird case, a nobleman who found no blood insisted on a trial to prove his bride's purity. A panel of matronly women was assembled to examine her. Yes, this actually happened, and if the husband couldn't perform? Oh, it got worse. There were annulments on the grounds of male impotence. Imagine standing in court while your in-laws testified about your bedroom failings. One 15th century man was ordered to demonstrate his virility in front of a group of physicians. He failed. His marriage was annulled. His ego? Probably never recovered, but not all noble sex was tragic or clinical. There were games, letters, flirtation. Some couples used coded phrases in public. Others exchanged gifts, rings, carved combs, or even miniature sculptures. One surviving ring from the 13th century bears the Latin inscription, Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. Romantic, sure, but probably followed by, unless your father arranges otherwise. Let's also talk clothing. Fashion in noble courts often towed the line between modest and suggestive. Women's gowns had low necklines, tightly laced bodices, and flowing sleeves. Men wore fitted hose and short tunics. Yes, those infamous codpieces came into style later, but even earlier outfits left little to the imagination. Church leaders complained endlessly about courtly fashion, claiming it incited lust. One bishop declared, "When women wear gowns slit to the thigh, how shall men think of heaven?" He had a point. Sort of course, some nobles were more discreet. They used symbols, rings with intertwined serpents, embroidery shaped like ivy vines. In literature, secret rendezvous were described as meeting in the orchard or visiting the spring. One famous poem, Roman de la Rose, turned desire into an extended allegory of a man trying to pick a flower from a guarded garden. Spoiler, it's not about gardening, so what happens when you zoom out? When you stop looking at just the beds and the sheets and start seeing the whole social web, you realize that noble sexuality was never really private. It was legal, economic, political. Every moan had implications. Every child born, or not born, could shift the balance of power. That's a lot of pressure for one candle at night, and yet, somehow, through all the awkward ceremonies and creepy in-laws, actual human connection did sometimes flicker to life. A laugh shared over spilled wine. A gentle touch beneath the table. A secret glance in a crowded room that says, "I see you." You exhale. The fire in the hearth dims. The marriage bed fades from view, and you float away from the stone walls and embroidered curtains, carrying with you the soft hush of whispered promises and the knowledge that even in a world of arranged unions and cold stone, warmth still found its way in. Now you're not in a castle. You're standing in a muddy village, halfway between a pigsty and a communal bread oven. Smoke rises from crooked chimneys, children run barefoot through puddles, and someone is definitely gutting a fish nearby. But under all that, you feel it, life. Messy, hungry, impatient life, welcome to the peasant world. No stained glass windows here, no perfumed bedding or imported silk. Just straw-filled mattresses, if you're lucky, itchy wool, and maybe a wooden tub of lukewarm water shared once a week with the rest of your family. Yet even here, sex hums under the surface, earthy, unpolished, and surprisingly creative. Let's start with the basics: peasant marriages. These weren't grand affairs. Often, they were casual, even informal. A couple might declare themselves married in front of witnesses and then move in together. No fancy ceremonies needed. The church preferred a formal blessing, of course, but out here in the countryside, survival came before sacraments. That also meant that sex often happened before official marriage. In fact, marriage by habit and repute was a common concept. If you lived together, worked together, and shared a bed, then everyone kind of shrugged and said, "Yeah, that counts." The church sometimes caught up years later, retroactively blessing unions when a priest finally passed through, and while historians still argue whether this meant medieval villagers were more liberated or just more pragmatic. One thing's clear: intimacy wasn't always about divine approval. It was about proximity. You worked side by side in the fields, traded bread and gossip, and when the sun went down, you were already in the same room. Privacy wasn't a medieval luxury. A whole family might sleep in one bed, or at least the same room, divided only by a thin curtain or maybe a strategically hung sheet. So what did courtship look like? Forget the roses and poetry. A peasant flirted with a smirk, a handful of berries, or by teasing you at the well. One surviving poem from the Low Countries describes a man wooing a woman with a good onion and 2 eggs. Romantic? Maybe not. Effective? Probably. There were dances, of course. Church approved, naturally, though the line between innocent fun and sinful bumping was thin. Some dances were circular, with hand-holding and quick footwork. Others involved paired spinning, and if your hand accidentally brushed a hip. Well, who could say it wasn't just part of the rhythm? Fairs and festivals were hotbeds of connection. When harvest was done or saints were celebrated, the village let loose. There was mead. There were games, and yes, there were plenty of opportunities to sneak away behind a haystack. Some festivals, like May Day, carried a not-so-subtle undercurrent of fertility rites. Young couples disappeared into the woods and came back with flushed cheeks and plausible deniability. "We were looking for flowers," they'd say. Unsurprisingly, there were a lot of pre-wedding pregnancies. Church records from rural England in the 14th century suggest up to 30% of brides were visibly pregnant at the altar. No one was thrilled about it, but unless you were marrying way above your station, it didn't ruin your life. People muttered. Then they moved on. The baby arrived. Bread still needed baking. Of course, if a pregnancy happened without a wedding in sight, things got trickier. Single mothers might face fines, public penance, or, in some cases, exile from the village. But not always. In many tight-knit communities, people turned a blind eye or quietly helped. After all, everyone knew someone with a secret, but secrets weren't always safe. Gossip was the oxygen of medieval towns. Your neighbor saw who snuck into whose barn. The washerwomen exchanged rumors while scrubbing sheets in the stream. And if things got too juicy, someone might tell the local priest, especially if a feud was involved. Which brings us to the church again. Even in peasant life, religion loomed large. Your local priest might be poor, half-literate, and drunk by noon, but he still carried enormous social power. Confession was expected. And if you confessed to fornication, you could be assigned public penance, maybe a procession through the village in sackcloth, maybe standing barefoot during Mass with a candle in hand. Still, villagers weren't exactly pure in mind. In fact, some of the bawdiest medieval jokes come from this class. One popular story involved a young woman tricking her confessor into sex by claiming it was part of her penance. Another featured a man hiding under a bed while his wife entertained a lover, only for the bed to collapse mid-tryst. The stories were crude, cheeky, and often centered around clever women getting the better of clueless men. Even the songs were full of innuendo. Shepherds and milkmaids, birds and bees, all coded language for encounters that probably didn't involve just animal husbandry. One English ballad ends with a line about a woman whose apron string broke during a walk through the forest. Historians still argue whether it's about tailoring, or not. Peasant women, while still under enormous social constraint, sometimes wielded more practical power in relationships than their noble counterparts. They worked. They earned. They managed homes, brewed ale, and ran market stalls. They were less protected. But also less locked away. Still, life could be dangerous. Assault was a real threat, and justice was inconsistent at best. If a woman accused someone of rape, she might be believed, or she might be blamed for tempting the man. Legal records show some perpetrators walking free while the woman's reputation was permanently stained. Even consensual sex could turn sour. A man might promise marriage, sleep with a woman, and then vanish. In some regions, women could sue for breach of promise, and if they had witnesses or written proof, they might win. But written proof was rare, and witnesses often stayed silent. The law leaned toward the men, as law tends to do when it's written by those who don't bleed monthly. Now let's talk about fertility. Medieval villagers didn't know about ovulation or sperm counts, but they weren't clueless. There were herbs believed to help conception, like rue, mugwort, or artemisia. There were also herbs used to prevent pregnancy, and some historians believe women passed this knowledge quietly among each other, especially older midwives and healers. Whether it worked is up for debate, but the effort says something about how women tried to carve out control in an uncontrollable world. Then there were charms. One document describes a woman tying a knotted ribbon under her skirt while whispering a prayer to Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth. Another suggests tucking a carved stone under the bed for fruitfulness. Not exactly science, but when your entire future hinged on children, you tried anything. And what happened if you had too many kids? Or couldn't afford another mouth? Well, infanticide was a whispered sin, rare but not unheard of. There were stories, quiet, chilling stories, about babies left in forests, or accidents that happened too conveniently. But these were desperate acts, driven by starvation or shame. For most, the answer was just to keep going. One more child. One more harvest. One more prayer. Let's shift to fashion for a moment. You're a young peasant woman, walking to the market. Your kirtle, a basic dress, is tight across the bust because you stitched it that way, on purpose. Your apron is clean, your hair's braided, and you've dabbed rosewater on your neck, made by boiling petals in a pot with a pinch of salt. You know someone's going to notice, and someone does. A boy with strong hands and terrible shoes. He offers to carry your basket. You pretend to protest. He jokes about the weight. About how it might crush his spine unless you marry him immediately. You roll your eyes. You keep walking. But your smile says, maybe, that's what sex was like, for so many people in the medieval world, not grand or noble or stained-glass poetic. It was quick glances, whispered jokes, stolen time. It was bodies that smelled of smoke and sheep grease, not perfume. It was muddy paths and damp straw. It was imperfect, eager, and as human as anything in history. Of course, sometimes it was funny. One surviving village record from Germany describes a man who got caught pantsless in the goose pen with his neighbor's wife. His excuse? He was checking for eggs. The court fined him 2 chickens and a barrel of ale. The goose, presumably, recovered. You lie there, thinking about that straw mattress, scratchy, flattened, and home to more than just dreams. You imagine the creaking of wood above you, the soft murmur of 2 voices sharing a secret, the way a single candle could make someone look beautiful if you squinted just right. This was a world without ideal bodies, without filters, without scented bath bombs. But it had its own kind of heat. Not the polished heat of courtly love or the fevered intensity of holy ecstasy, but something slow, and warm, and deeply, wonderfully ordinary, and that, sometimes, is the sexiest thing of all. The bell tower rings again, soft, hollow, echoing down a narrow cobbled street. You follow it, your feet brushing against cold stone, until you find yourself in a much smaller, darker space. The floor is swept, the candles are low, and a screen of carved wood separates one half of the room from the other. You're in a confessional booth. It smells like incense and old breath. Dust rises from the velvet kneeler. A shadow stirs behind the lattice, and a voice, gentle but firm, says, "In nomine Patris." You swallow, because what you're about to confess isn't just a lie you told your neighbor. It's not that you stole eggs or skipped mass. No, tonight you're here to talk about that dream you had. Or that secret meeting behind the bakery, or the fact that you think Brother Andre has really nice forearms. Welcome to the realm of sin, where even your thoughts are not your own, and sex is a spiritual transaction waiting to be audited. Let's make something very clear right from the start. In medieval Christianity, lust wasn't just a temptation. It was a moral landmine. And confession? That was your only escape route, provided you could say everything just right, but how much could you say? That depended on who was listening. By the 13th century, the church had turned confession into a regular duty. Parishioners were expected to confess at least once a year, usually before Easter. Some confessed much more often, weekly, or even daily, especially in more pious communities. And when it came to sins of the flesh, the priests had heard it all. There were confession manuals, actual books, that guided confessors through every possible scenario. They asked questions. Have you committed fornication? With whom? Was the person married? Were you married? Was it your cousin? Was it in a church? Did you pay them? That last one came with a specific penance. By the way, the point wasn't just to catch you, it was to map out your soul like a crime scene. The manual would note whether it was consensual, whether it was repeated, whether it involved unusual positioning. Yes, really. Because even within marriage, not everything was permitted. There was an ideal order to things: missionary, lights off, no pleasure please. We're Catholic. Some priests went beyond the manual. They'd lean in, voice low, and ask follow-ups. Historians still debate whether these probing questions were for spiritual guidance or personal curiosity. Some were likely just trying to get it over with. Others? Well, human nature being what it is. Let's just say the booth had its own kind of power. There's a fringe belief among scholars that certain confessors developed reputations for being easy. You'd go to Father Martin if you wanted minimal penance. Avoid Father Jacques unless you wanted to cry for an hour and do penance barefoot through the snow. Women were held to even higher scrutiny. A young girl confessing impure thoughts might be assigned days of fasting or a pilgrimage to a nearby shrine. A widow admitting to sleeping with a tenant. Public penance and community disgrace, and it wasn't just what you did. It was what you dreamed. Medieval theology said your dreams could be sinful, especially if you enjoyed them. Waking up flushed and flustered could send you straight to confession. Some believed demons could visit in dreams, tempting you with carnal visions. Others blamed indigestion or the devil perching upon the chest. Early sleep paralysis. Anyone, if you were a monk or nun, these temptations were even more dangerous. Celibacy wasn't just a lifestyle, it was your covenant with God. But human biology didn't care. Some monastic records detail entire communities plagued by nocturnal emissions, leading to mass confession, shared shame, and, in one case, a monastery-wide bean diet thought to reduce urges. One monk wrote in his diary, "I awoke in shame and wept bitterly, praying to Saint Agnes to cleanse my mind." Another confessed to having impure thoughts during morning prayers and was sentenced to copy psalms by hand for 6 weeks. In Latin. With no ink breaks, in nunneries, things were quieter, at least publicly. But there are hints of emotional intimacy that strayed into physical. Letters survive between women who signed off with, "Yours," in longing, body and soul. The church might have turned a blind eye, or it might have investigated. Records are vague. Perhaps deliberately, and outside the walls of cloisters and convents. The church still reached, priests preached fire and brimstone against sex outside marriage, especially during Lent, Advent, and other holy seasons. But everyone knew the truth, people slipped. So the confessional became a revolving door for half-whispered sins and equal parts shame and relief. There's even a story about a priest in 15th century Italy who built a secret compartment into his confessional. He took favors instead of penance. He was eventually caught, stripped of his robes, and imprisoned. But not before 3 pages of confession logs mysteriously vanished. Still, for most believers, the confessional wasn't just about guilt. It was a kind of therapy, rudimentary, uneven, but comforting. You could say things you couldn't say to anyone else. You could admit fear, longing, confusion. You could name the thing that twisted inside you at night, and then, if you were lucky, the priest would say the words, "Ego te absolvo." I absolve you, you'd leave lighter. Not clean, exactly. But cleaner. Until next time, now let's talk about indulgences, a sort of get-out-of-hell-earlier coupon you could buy or earn through good works. Want to clear your conscience faster? Give to the poor. Say a certain prayer. Walk barefoot to a shrine. Or, eventually, just pay a little coin. Yes, medieval people could literally purchase partial forgiveness, though it didn't work like a vending machine. The idea was that good deeds built spiritual credit. But by the late Middle Ages, the system was deeply corrupted. Some priests sold indulgences like raffle tickets, promising reduced time in purgatory for everything from gossip to adultery. One infamous preacher claimed that a coin dropped into the collection box would spring a soul from purgatory. Historians still argue whether this line was poetic metaphor or just solid marketing. For the sexually guilty, indulgences were a lifeline. Couldn't stop wandering thoughts during Mass. Pay your way back into grace. Slept with someone you shouldn't have. Donate to build a new altar. The system was flawed, but it gave people hope. But not everyone found peace in confession. Some stewed. Some spiraled. There's a recorded case of a woman who confessed to excessive enjoyment during intercourse with her husband. The priest told her to abstain completely for a year. Her husband left. She entered a convent. Whether that was an overreaction or divine calling, unclear. Others took their sins straight to penance. Flagellation, yes, actual whipping, became a religious practice in some circles. Believers would beat themselves, publicly or privately, to punish the body and silence desire. One group in 13th century Italy marched through towns in blood-streaked robes, chanting prayers and striking their backs with leather cords. Saintly? Maybe. Intense? Definitely. And then there were the confessions that were never heard. The quiet sins. The ones that didn't seem worth the risk. A hand brushed under a blanket. A glance held too long. The unspeakable desires that had no name, no box to tick in the confession manual. Those people carried their guilt alone. You lie still now, thinking of that booth, the hush, the flickering light through the screen, the pressure to speak, to be clean. You think of the voices whispering through time, all asking the same question, am I wrong for wanting what I want? And just beyond the confessional, you hear the bells again. Not calling you to mass this time. Just echoing across the stone, down into your sleep, that you think of the voices whispering through time, all asking the same question, am I wrong for wanting what I want? And then, you realize, the confessional wasn't just about cleansing the soul. It was about cataloging desire. Who you touched, who you dreamed about, who made you feel something dangerous in your gut, it was all turned into data for the divine ledger. And whether you were a farmer's daughter or a baroness, your secrets ended up in the same dusty wooden box, filtered through the same half-lidded eyes of a priest who may or may not have been half asleep. Some confessors gave penances that were almost performative, walking to a distant shrine on your knees, reciting entire books of psalms, fasting for a month. Others were oddly lenient, say 2 Hail Marys and be mindful not to do it again. And still others asked questions that made even the boldest hearts freeze. There are rare cases where we glimpse the odd power dynamic that played out inside those booths. In 15th century France, a priest was accused of using confession as a way to groom parishioners, asking young women detailed, intimate questions and then forgiving them with touches that blurred the line between absolution and abuse. He was quietly relocated, not punished. The church protected its own. It often still does, but the truth is, most confessors were likely sincere, overworked. Imperfect, but trying to keep an impossible flock from moral ruin. You imagine some of them waking in the middle of the night, their own dreams flushed with guilt, praying for the strength to resist what their flock couldn't, because that's the twist, isn't it? The men who heard the confessions were human too. And sin, like steam, rises in the cracks. Now, you pull away from the booth. The door creaks. The candle flickers lower. Your feet shuffle across cold stone as you step back into the night, your breath puffing in front of you like a cloud. Behind you, the priest murmurs another absolution, for someone else now. A different voice, a different guilt, but always the same plea, forgive me. You walk on. A bell tolls in the distance, the booth fades into the fog, your footsteps crunch over frost-laced grass now. The village is asleep. Chimneys sigh smoke into the night. You slip past the chapel and down a narrow trail, where the scent of crushed herbs rises faintly from the soil. Something rustles in the hedgerow, just a rabbit, or maybe a cat, but you keep moving, because there's a light ahead. You reach a crooked wooden door. No bell, no sign. Just a loop of garlic strung above the lintel and a dried sprig of mugwort tucked behind a nail. You knock once, twice. The door creaks open, and there she is, the wise woman. She's not a nun. Not a midwife. Not exactly a healer either, though everyone in town comes to her eventually. For coughs, for warts. And for other things. She nods at you, wordless, and you step inside. The room is warm. Heavy with the scent of beeswax and rosemary. Hanging bundles of dried herbs sway from the rafters. A black cat purrs on the windowsill. And on the table, beside a carved wooden bowl, lies something forbidden, a small linen pouch tied shut with red thread. Inside it, a mix of crushed juniper berries, pennyroyal, and powdered bark. It's not medicine. Not exactly, it's contraception, because here's the thing no one says in sermons or ballads: medieval people tried not to get pregnant all the time. They just didn't write it down in neat, church-approved books. Historians still argue whether these folk methods worked, but the recipes exist, in coded form, in marginal notes, in the memories of women who whispered them in kitchens and fields. These weren't formulas scrawled by monks. They were passed hand to hand, mother to daughter, friend to friend. Sometimes with warnings: boil too long and it turns bitter. Add too much and you'll fall asleep for days. Sometimes the goal was spacing births. Sometimes it was avoiding a dangerous pregnancy. And sometimes, yes, it was about not bearing the child of a man who shouldn't have touched you in the first place. The church didn't approve, of course. Officially, any interference with conception was a sin. The idea was that sex was only sacred when it might lead to new life. Anything else, herbs, withdrawal, even impure thoughts, was suspect. But the village woman with 5 children and an aching back, she didn't care about theological nuance. She just wanted to sleep through the night. So what did they use? Some wore amulets tied around the thigh, carved with symbols. Others drank infusions made with silphium, when it was still available, rue or Queen Anne's lace. Some inserted sponges soaked in vinegar or wine. A few applied salves made from ground mint and animal fat, said to cool the womb. Were these effective? Hard to say. But they were attempts, desperate, clever, human, and when prevention failed. There were other, darker remedies. This is the part medieval texts rarely name directly. But if you read between the lines, it's there. Recipes for bringing on the menses, for cleansing the womb, for restoring the moon's cycle. You don't have to be a scholar to know what that means. Abortifacients, natural substances used to induce miscarriage, were risky, both medically and legally. They could kill a woman if improperly dosed. They could also land her in court, especially if the pregnancy was known. But still, they were used. Quietly. Carefully. And sometimes, heartbreakingly, too late. A court record from 1389 details a woman in Flanders accused of taking an herb against life. She refused to name the plant. She was fined, but not imprisoned. The judge noted she had 4 children already and no husband. The scribe wrote, simply, she wept. Let's step back for a moment. Because not all medieval sex led to fear and consequence. Sometimes it led to healing. In certain folk traditions, sexuality wasn't shameful, it was medicinal. Some wise women believed that sexual energy could ease melancholy or relieve blocked humors. A widow grieving too long might be encouraged to remarry for her health. A man who hadn't spilled his seed in months might be diagnosed with heat of the loins and prescribed a cold bath, or a cooperative partner. Even in monasteries, medical texts hinted at the physical toll of abstinence. One 13th century physician wrote, when the body is not relieved, the humors grow sour, and the heart turns inward. Not exactly subtle, some healers even crafted love philters, early aphrodisiacs made with cinnamon, ginger, honey, and sometimes less savory ingredients like bat's blood or dried lizard tail. More showmanship than science, maybe. But the placebo effect has always been potent. Still, not everyone seeking help wanted more desire. Many wanted less. There were charms for celibacy. Potions meant to cool lust. One odd remedy involved tying a dead toad to your thigh. Another prescribed fasting while gazing at an image of the Virgin Mary. And if that didn't work, you could always join a monastery. Or try, at least, but desire is stubborn. There's a story, half history, half rumor, about a nun who confessed to frequent urges. Her abbess instructed her to sleep with a cold stone under her pillow and recite psalms backward. She did this for weeks. Nothing changed. Eventually, she carved the stone into the shape of a man's face and named it Brother Silence. Let's talk more about midwives. They weren't just for delivering babies. They were counselors, secret keepers, and, in many cases, quiet rebels. A midwife knew whose husband was impotent, whose daughter had fallen ill, and which newlywed bride was too terrified to lie with her husband. She offered herbs, advice, comfort. Sometimes she whispered prayers. Sometimes she didn't, and yes, she sometimes helped end pregnancies. Not because she hated life, but because she saw too much of it. Too many young girls bleeding out in corners. Too many wives worn to the bone. Too many newborns buried in fields at dawn, wrapped in torn shifts and silence. One surviving midwifery text, written in coded Latin, includes a section titled "For When the Seed Takes Root in Sorrow." It lists warm baths, wild carrot, and rest under moonlight. Not a guarantee. Just a chance, but midwives were vulnerable. The church both needed and distrusted them. They weren't clergy. They weren't doctors. They were women with power, and that was dangerous. In times of plague or famine, midwives were sometimes blamed. Accused of witchcraft. Tried for causing miscarriages or making love charms. Some were tortured. Others fled. A few survived by aligning with the church, promising to report irregularities. A quiet betrayal for a louder survival. You sit in the wise woman's cottage now. She offers you tea. It smells like chamomile and fear. She doesn't ask your name. She doesn't need to. She's seen dozens like you, heard every story. Yours isn't shocking. Just familiar. You sip. It's bitter. She smiles. Don't drink the last mouthful, she says, without explaining why. Later, when you leave, the stars are bright. The path is silent. But your body feels different, warmer, steadier. As if part of the burden has shifted into the night air, you walk slowly, your mind full of dried herbs, whispered instructions, and the quiet power of women who kept each other alive, even when the world called them sinners. That you walk slowly, your mind full of dried herbs, whispered instructions, and the quiet power of women who kept each other alive, even when the world called them sinners. But as the frost bites deeper and the sky opens wider, a question flickers across your thoughts. How many of them were caught? How many wise women, midwives, herbalists, how many disappeared not into old age, but into trial records, burned scripts, nameless graves? There's a chilling shift in the air, because beginning in the late 15th century, the church and civil authorities started to draw harder lines. Where once a pouch of dried pennyroyal was a grandmother's remedy, it now became suspicious. Where once a midwife was trusted with life and death, she became a target, especially if the birth went wrong, or if too many village men felt emasculated by her quiet competence. The early whispers of witch hunts began here, in that unease, that fear of women who knew things they weren't supposed to know. They were accused of poisoning infants, of summoning storms, of using sex magic to weaken husbands. Sometimes their only crime was attending too many births where the baby didn't cry. Sometimes it was refusing to name their herb, and once a midwife stood accused, her knowledge of medicine, of contraception, of bodies, was twisted into evidence. The same tools she used to protect women became her noose. But tonight, in this moment, you're safe. You clutch your pouch, still warm from the wise woman's hands. Behind you, her shutters close with a soft click, and ahead, in the cold dark of the Middle Ages, you carry something they tried to burn out but never quite could: memory. Wisdom, and the small, defiant promise that women will always help each other survive. The fire crackles low now. Embers shift. Smoke coils lazily up through a narrow chimney as your gaze drifts from wooden beams to stone hearth to the thick fur pelts draped across the bed. This is not a peasant's home. This is something far more deliberate. Richer. Cleaner. Stiller. You're in the chamber of a noblewoman. Her name doesn't matter. It changes, depending on where you are: France, England, Castile, but her role remains the same. She is beautiful, composed, guarded. Her hair is plaited tightly against her head in loops. Her sleeves are wide, her smile is small, and her bed is both altar and battleground. Tonight, you're not her. You're the one brushing her hair, tying the last ribbon. Hearing the softest sighs escape her throat after the feast has ended. You're close enough to smell her perfume, myrtle and clove water, close enough to sense the thoughts she's not allowed to say out loud, because marriage among the nobility wasn't about love. Not really. It was about land. Dowries. Alliances. The consolidation of power in a world where survival meant inheritance and titles, not attraction. A noblewoman's body was a diplomatic instrument, measured not by beauty, but by what wombs could produce, yet, even within that cold reality, there was desire. It simply had to hide. Let's start with the wedding night. This was no private affair. There was ceremony, witnesses. And, depending on the region, a literal audience. The bed would be blessed. Sometimes the priest stood in the doorway with a crucifix, praying for fertility. The bride might be escorted into the bedchamber by older women who offered whispered advice about how to submit with grace. Then the door would close, or, worse, stay cracked open. In some traditions, a trusted attendant remained in the room to ensure the deed was done. Because consummation wasn't just personal, it was political. If the marriage wasn't sealed, it could be annulled. If the bride bled on the sheets, it was taken as proof of virginity. The stained linen might be shown publicly, like a relic of state, but the body doesn't always follow the script. Some girls were terrified. They were 13, 14, married to men twice their age. Others were older and had been raised their whole lives to believe that sex was something endured, not enjoyed. Noble manuals offered little comfort. One advised wives to lie still and think of Christ. Another said to avoid eye contact lest passion rise. But of course, passion did rise, even in duty, desire flickered. And in the quiet moments between embroidery and confession, noblewomen passed notes. Secrets. Codes. Love letters folded into bodices. A glance at a squire too long. A sigh during dance practice. And sometimes more. Let's talk about the ladies-in-waiting, noble girls who served higher-ranking women. They lived in the same chambers, changed clothes together, bathed side by side in wooden tubs. And they talked. About husbands who were cruel. About knights who smiled too sweetly. About how it felt the first time. About how it never felt at all. Some of those relationships turned physical. Giggling under bed covers. Holding hands when the candles were out. A kiss stolen during travel. These liaisons weren't written about in court poetry, but they existed. They were real. They just slipped beneath the page, and then there were courtly lovers, men outside the marriage. Carefully chosen. Discreet. Sometimes just flirtation. Other times, full-blown affairs. Risky, of course. But for women locked in loveless unions, it offered something close to autonomy. In 12th century Aquitaine, the court of Eleanor and her daughters became legendary for its chivalric codes. Knights would serve a lady, fight for her favor, were her token in battle, and the erotic charge of that devotion danced just on the edge of scandal. Whether consummated or not, it gave women power in a world that denied them almost everything else. Historians still argue whether this courtly love culture was empowering or just another cage, pretty words masking real limitations. But it mattered to the women who lived it. Because at least it gave language to something beyond breeding and obedience. Still, the consequences for stepping too far were brutal. A noble woman caught in adultery could be divorced, imprisoned, or executed. Her children might be declared illegitimate. Her lands forfeited. Her name erased from family trees. There's the case of Marguerite de la Tour, a minor noble in Burgundy. After being caught in an affair with a pageboy, she was confined to a convent for life. Her lover was hanged. The letters between them were burned. Only a single servant account survives. They laughed too often. Even unproven rumors could destroy reputations. Noble courts were hotbeds of gossip. A rival might hint that a lady had grown too fond of her confessor, or that her belly swelled a little too soon after marriage. Whispers could travel faster than truth, and were far more delicious, so how did noblewomen protect themselves? Discretion, sisterhood, and, sometimes, bribery. A trusted maid could stand guard at the door. A loyal wet nurse might be paid to pass messages. Midwives who tended noble births also knew which monthly restoratives to administer when needed. The court doctor could be both a spy and a shield. Depending on who paid better, and when women couldn't control their fates, they found control in ritual. They wore charms, small lead discs etched with symbols and saints. They prayed to obscure virgin martyrs, whose own bodies had been untouched by man. They fasted before conjugal nights, hoping thinness might repel lust. They lit candles to Saint Anne, protector of mothers, hoping their husbands would fall asleep drunk. Others took the opposite route. They drank fortified wine with crushed almonds and honey. They perfumed themselves with musk oil, borrowed from the eastern trade routes. One manuscript even recommends sprinkling rose petals in the bed to soften a man's anger. Whether it worked or not, the symbolism was clear. Women found magic where they could. Let's not forget the erotic literature of the elite. You might think porn is a modern invention, but noblemen, and occasionally noblewomen, commissioned hand-copied volumes of titillating tales. French fabliaux, Italian novellas, Latin bawdy poems. Some were crude, others surprisingly tender. A few focused on women's pleasure. And while these were officially for men's entertainment, we know from margin notes and scribbled initials that some women read them too, quietly, under quilts, by candlelight. So what was sex actually like for a noblewoman? It depended on the husband, on the timing, on whether the wine was strong and the windows shut. It could be duty. It could be terror. It could be, rarely, joy. For a few, it was power, especially older widows, who had inherited property and freedom. Some of them took lovers openly. Others never remarried, choosing solitude over submission. A famous example is the Lady of Nevers, who kept a household of exclusively female attendants and ruled her estate with sharp letters and quiet resolve. You imagine her now. Gray-haired, sharp-eyed, sitting in a chair by the fire, reading a worn psalter, while a young maid brushes her hair. No words are spoken. Just soft breathing. The comfort of a room without threat. Sex in the medieval noble world wasn't glamorous. It wasn't always brutal either. It was a spectrum, like everything else. Colored by politics, shaped by expectation, constrained by fear. But where there's silence, there's always resistance. Where there are rules, there are always those who bend them. So as the fire dies down in this chamber, fur pelts tangled, bed curtains swaying gently with the draft, you rest your hand on the embroidered coverlet and imagine the stories not written down. The wife who kissed her lady-in-waiting when no one looked, the noble daughter who fell for the troubadour with a broken harp, the widow who paid the stable boy not with coin, but with poems, and the maid who saw everything and told no one. You close your eyes. The air smells like rose oil and damp wool. Somewhere downstairs, a guard shifts in place. A hound scratches at the kitchen door. Life goes on, but in this room, under this heavy quilt, there is warmth. Memory. A secret history, woven stitch by stitch through time, across bodies, inside whispers. You don't need to know their names, you only need to remember that they were there. The bells don't ring this time. Instead, you wake to soft footsteps echoing off marble floors and the hush of woolen robes brushing against stone. You're no longer in a bed. You're kneeling on cold tile, shoulder to shoulder with others who rise before the sun. You smell beeswax and damp mortar, hear the scrape of a metal censer and the chant of Latin rising and falling like slow breath. You're in a monastery. Or perhaps a convent, and here, things are very, very different. This isn't a world of marriage or love letters or even whispered flirtation. This is a world where celibacy is law, desire is considered dangerous, and every bodily impulse is an obstacle to salvation, or at least. That's the theory, because the truth is, even in the most devout, most rule-bound religious institutions of medieval Europe, sex and desire didn't vanish. They just went underground, sometimes even deeper than in the outside world. Let's start with monastic vows. When someone joined a monastic order, they promised three things: poverty, obedience, and chastity. That last one meant not just abstaining from sex, but from anything that might lead to it. No fleshly temptations. No immodest thoughts. No lingering eye contact, even with statues. Everything was supposed to be directed toward God alone, but monks and nuns were still human. That's why the rules were so specific. The Regula Benedicti, or Rule of Saint Benedict, instructed monks to sleep in separate beds, avoid being alone together, and keep their tunics belted at all times, especially at night. Why? Because nighttime was risky. The body does things in the dark. It stirs. It dreams. It betrays. In fact, whole chapters in monastic instruction books were dedicated to nocturnal emissions, or what they called pollutio nocturna. Some orders required monks to report them to their superiors. Others prescribed cold baths, herbal teas, or extended fasts. A few recommended sleeping on hard wooden boards instead of mattresses. To diminish pleasure. Monks also weren't supposed to bathe too often. Not just because water was scarce, but because clean bodies invited temptation. Especially if you were young. Especially if your fellow monk happened to be particularly kind, because let's face it, when you lock dozens of young men in a stone building for years on end, all dressed the same, living together in silence, it doesn't take long for curiosity to bloom, and it did. We have records, very discreet ones, of relationships forming inside monasteries. Sometimes romantic, sometimes physical. A surviving letter from a 12th century monk to another reads, "Your voice in the choir gives me peace, but your absence makes my hands tremble." Another wrote in his diary about the warmth of Brother Thomas's shoulder beside mine on winter nights. Were these just spiritual longings? Historians still argue. But certain punishments handed down by abbots suggest that sometimes, lines were crossed. Some monks were reassigned suddenly. Others were exiled. A few disappeared from records entirely. In nunneries, it was no different. In some ways, it was even more intense. Cloistered away, often from a young age, nuns formed tight bonds. They cared for one another, slept in adjoining cells, and performed rituals together daily. Some of their letters contain language so intimate it feels modern. "You are the breath in my prayers. No light shines brighter than your hands in the morning." Did these relationships turn physical? Sometimes, probably. There are incidents recorded, nuns caught together and punished, removed from their positions, or sent to harsher houses. There's even an account from 14th century Germany where a mother superior was accused of embracing her sisters too warmly during night prayers, but just like in the outside world, sex here wasn't just about bodies. It was about power, because not everyone chose to be here. Some were given to monasteries as children. Traded like currency to fulfill pious family obligations. Others had no dowry and no marriage prospects. For them, the convent wasn't a calling. It was a sentence, and so, rebellion brewed. Sometimes it was small, stealing wine, sneaking out past curfew, carving names into pews. Other times it was bigger, secret letters passed to outsiders, forbidden liaisons with visiting clerics, or confessions of desire that shattered the illusion of chastity. One nun, Sister Beatrix of Moravia, was said to have had a decade-long correspondence with a court musician. They exchanged poems. He smuggled in ribbons. When she was found out, she was stripped of her habit and forced to walk barefoot through the cloister, reciting penitential psalms. But not all religious people were scandalized by desire. Some embraced it, sort of. There's a tradition in Christian mysticism known as bride mysticism, where nuns considered themselves brides of Christ. At first glance, this was symbolic, complete devotion to Jesus. But the language used in some of their writings? Not exactly subtle. Take Saint Catherine of Siena, who wrote of the kiss of divine lips and the feeling of God's hand pressing against my breast. Or Marjorie Kemp, who described her spiritual visions in almost erotic terms, being lifted, enfolded, and filled with sweet fervor. Historians call this sacred eroticism. The idea that divine love could feel like physical pleasure. That spiritual union might mimic or even replace sexual fulfillment. It wasn't considered sinful, at least not always. After all, these were visions. These women weren't claiming to break their vows. They were just, very close to God. Still, it made some church authorities uncomfortable. And so mystic writings were often edited, censored, or labeled divinely inspired only after the author had died. And then there were the priests. Celibacy for priests became mandatory in the Latin Church during the 12th century. But it didn't mean celibacy became common. Far from it. Parish priests often had unofficial wives, called concubines. Everyone in the village knew. Some of these women lived in the rectory, cooked meals, raised children. In one case, a bishop wrote sternly to a priest who had a concubine and a second woman for pleasure. The priest replied, "Better the company of a known woman than the whispers of boys." Blunt and revealing. The church technically forbade these relationships, but enforcement was uneven. Some bishops cracked down, others turned a blind eye, especially if the priest was popular or paid his dues. In cities, things were worse. Records from Avignon, Paris, and Rome mention brothels run for clergy or by clergy. One infamous street in Rome was known as Vicus Scriptorum Sacerdotalium, the alley of the priests' prostitutes. Still, not all religious figures were corrupt or cynical. Many genuinely struggled. They wanted to live holy lives. They fasted, prayed, mortified their flesh. But the desire didn't leave. It coiled inside them, sometimes expressed in art, sometimes in confession, sometimes in feverish dreams scratched into the margins of psalters. Some monks wrote love poetry. Not openly, but cloaked in metaphor. My heart, bound by a cord of thorns, bleeds for you. Or, the garden of your eyes bears fruit even in winter. Some nuns painted images of the Virgin Mary so sensuously that later artists copied them for centuries. One nun in 13th century Spain was known for drawing Christ with a mouth too full of kindness and a body too bare for modesty. You think of them now, cloistered, silent, aching. You wonder how many sat up in their narrow beds, hearts pounding, staring into the dark and begging God to make them pure, or make them forget, or make them feel less alone, because that's the core of it, isn't it? Not just sex or sin or punishment, but loneliness. The kind that wraps around your ribs and makes even a soft glance feel like a feast. The kind that makes you long for the heat of another person's presence, not just their body, but their being. In monasteries and convents, where silence was a virtue and flesh was a burden, that longing had nowhere to go. So it twisted into visions. Into pain. Into music. Into guilt. Into whispers carved into stone walls, now weathered and half erased. You press your palm to the cool tile beneath you. Somewhere above, a bell tolls prime. Dawn creeps into the sky. The monks rise. The nuns light their candles. The chant begins again, but in the spaces between the notes, something else hums, unspoken, unwritten, unforgotten. But in the spaces between the notes, something else hums. Unspoken, unwritten, unforgotten. and sometimes, even that wasn't enough. In one parchment margin, scrawled beside a monk's commentary on Leviticus, is a single line, almost like a sigh, "Oh, that I might be just a man, and not this soul in prison." It's lonely work, repressing your nature in the name of eternity. You begin to see it not just in confessionals and sermons, but in the calligraphy itself, letters tightening with agitation, lines pressed too hard into vellum, prayers inked and re-inked in nervous repetition. Desire didn't vanish behind abbey walls. It sublimated. Into art, into ritual, into moments so brief they felt like hallucinations. A hand lingering an extra second during washing. The way someone's voice dipped during chant. The silent, aching attention paid to a face in a painting, not the holy kind, and still, the world outside spun forward. Fields were plowed. Markets bustled. Lovers whispered in barns. But inside the cloister, the air remained thick with incense, regret, and the longing for something neither fully denied nor fully claimed. You're still kneeling, the light filters in, but it's not yet time to stand. The smell of yeast and old parchment clings to the breeze as you step through another heavy wooden door, this time, on the other side of the wall. The monastery's twin. The convent's mirror. The gender has flipped, but the vows are the same. Poverty. Obedience. Chastity, only this time, you're not inside the cell. You're outside. In the village. Watching from across the lane as monks move in formation like chess pieces, collecting herbs, tilling gardens, copying psalms, but that's not all they're doing, because next door, separated by a thin field and a crumbling stone wall, is a convent. And whether you were a farmer, a merchant, or a wayward peddler passing through, you knew the old joke: if you want to find temptation, look between two chapels. Because where monasteries and convents stood side by side, often within the same religious order, things got complicated. You start to notice the little signs: a loaf of warm bread delivered discreetly at dusk. A handkerchief dropped accidentally during shared Massachusetts. A song that lingers a few beats too long as one side of the choir trades verses with the other, and behind those walls, young men and young women, both told to suppress every flicker of desire, now pressed within whispering distance of each other. Historians still debate how often rules were broken. But court records, letters, and papal complaints suggest, often enough to become a problem. There's the scandal of Rouen, 1321, where a young monk and a novice nun were discovered meeting by night through a tunnel in the cellar. The investigation found that this route was not newly made, implying it had been used before, possibly for years. The monk was expelled. The nun vanished from records. And the cellar was sealed with holy water and bricks. In another case, a convent in Cologne was reprimanded after several sisters were found in possession of secular clothing, hidden under floorboards. Why? So they could blend in during nighttime excursions beyond the cloister. One of them later confessed, not under duress, but weeping, "I only wished to dance again." And in perhaps the most bizarre tale, a monastery in southern Italy installed a rotating grill in the confessional booth, designed not for security, but for flirting. One side claimed it offered clarity in spiritual instruction. The other side admitted, years later, that it was simply more thrilling to see the nun's lips when she whispered her sins. Let's step back for a moment. The church believed strongly in segregating the sexes. Even in religious life, the idea was to minimize temptation. But for practical reasons, shared patronage, pooled resources, geography, many male and female houses ended up within earshot of each other. Some even shared chapels, water supplies, or confessionals, and in those small, daily interactions, desire found its way in. Even innocent gestures, handing over a jug of water, adjusting the altar cloth, could become charged. Especially for novices, who had never known love, or even flirtation, outside their families. Suddenly, the opposite sex wasn't just an abstract danger. It was Brother Matthew. Sister Claire. A voice. A face, you imagine them now, Brother Matthew, 23, still missing the softness of the world. His fingers ink-stained from copying psalms, but his dreams tugging towards someone he shouldn't name, Sister Claire, eyes lowered, lips moving silently through the psalter, but her heartbeat stuttering when she hears his voice in the next row of the choir. They try. They fast. They confess, but even when the body is stilled, the mind wanders, and sometimes, it's not romance that pulls them toward each other. Sometimes it's curiosity. Or loneliness. Or even complicity. Because the rules are harsh, but when you know someone else is breaking them too, it gets easier to breathe. A few orders dealt with this proactively. The Cistercians, for instance, were known for strictly separating men and women, no shared. No overlapping schedules, not even visual contact during Massachusetts. When a convent requested a Cistercian monk to help with construction, the monks insisted on building a wall before the work began, lest the devil slip through the gap. Other orders weren't quite so disciplined. In more rural settings, religious houses leaned on each other for survival. Monks might deliver grain to the nuns. Nuns might send bandages or candles in return. And in that space, shared necessity, came shared humanity. One monk wrote, anonymously, "They do not look as the paintings do. They laugh. They blush. They argue about salt." Even that was enough to fracture the illusion of celibacy. Then there were the intentional arrangements, places where the lines blurred even more. In double monasteries, men and women lived in the same complex, often under the leadership of an abbess or abbot, but in separate quarters. This structure was more common in the early medieval period, especially in Anglo-Saxon England, but fragments of it survived into the later centuries, and while the goal was piety, some of these institutions embraced a kind of balance. Men and women working in harmony. Teaching, copying, farming, praying. A shared spiritual life, not a segregated one, sounds lovely in theory. But records suggest these communities often faced scandal. In one 11th century chronicle, a double monastery was described as having too much song, too much wine, and too little shame. Whether that was true or just ecclesiastical slander is anyone's guess. Still, even in the most upright communities, the fear of temptation was constant. Some monks went so far as to wear chastity rings, iron bands around the thigh or even groin, to prevent wandering hands. Some convents locked their gates with double bolts and instructed sisters to sleep with arms crossed over their chests to avoid indecent touching during dreams. Of course, the more rules you make, the more you reveal what people are already doing. In one set of visitation records from France, a bishop scolds a convent for laying in pairs during Compline, while another account from northern Italy laments that a monk climbed the olive tree nightly to glimpse the novices at song. It all seems silly now, maybe. Cloaks and shadows and staircases worn down by furtive feet, but the emotions were real. Sometimes there was pain, like the monk who confessed to falling into spiritual sickness after being reassigned to a convent with beautiful singers. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He fasted so severely he passed out during prayers. Eventually, he was moved to a mountain hermitage, where he lived out the rest of his days copying texts and humming to himself. Other times there was joy. One nun wrote in her diary about a monk who delivered figs to the convent every Friday. She never spoke to him. Never even saw him clearly. But the figs became a ritual. He places them in the same basket. Always two more than asked. I take the first one, close my eyes, and imagine his hands. Did she break her vows? No. But she lived in that ache. And in a world where so many women were denied ownership of their bodies, even that soft defiance, claiming a moment of imagined sweetness, was radical. Eventually, some of these convents and monasteries shut down. Too many scandals. Too many letters. Too many fig baskets. The church restructured them. Separated the houses. Reassigned the troublemakers. And over time, The walls grew higher, the schedule stricter, the doors heavier, but still, if you walk the ruins now, step over cracked tiles and mossy lintels, you'll find small carvings in the stone. A name. A date. A heart with 2 initials. They were there, and not all of them were sorry that they were there, and not all of them were sorry. In fact, a few weren't sorry at all. One retired abbess, decades after leaving her post, dictated a memoir, never published, never preserved in full. Only fragments survive. But in those scraps, she describes a world of candlelit music, secret friendships, and affections too intense for the rules of men. She never named names. She never described bodies, but she wrote this: I loved 2 sisters in my lifetime. One with my eyes. One with my hands. I sinned not against God, but against men who never asked what love might mean inside stone walls. Even now, her words feel like a whisper behind the silence. A note left in the margin. A pressed flower between psalms, because the deeper you listen, the more clearly you hear it. Sex in medieval monastic life wasn't just scandal or shame. It was longing, resistance, curiosity, and sometimes even hope. A reminder that where humans breathe, they yearn. And where they yearn, they find each other, even across the chapel, even behind locked doors, even when the bells are ringing. You wake up to the scent of honey and something sharper, spice, vinegar. Maybe it's the tang of betrayal. You're in a palace courtyard now, far from cloisters and convents. Silk banners flutter from carved balconies. Water gurgles in stone fountains. And someone, somewhere, is laughing just a little too sweetly over a bowl of dates. Welcome to the court, where sex isn't just personal. It's political. You're standing between brocade-draped archways and polished marble, but you'd better watch your step. Because behind every soft couch is a hard secret. Every gaze across the banquet table carries at least 3 meanings. And every bedchamber door can open to either pleasure or ruin. Here, intimacy is strategy. Let's start with one of the most notorious medieval courts, Byzantium. The imperial palace in Constantinople was practically a theater of seduction and surveillance, where emperors and empresses wielded sexual rumors like weapons. The court eunuchs, trusted by rulers because they were considered safe, often became the most powerful intermediaries in bedroom politics. They knew who snuck where, who whispered to whom, and who was just a little too pleased with their new silk tunic. One empress, Zoe Porphyrogenita, famously took not 1, not 2, but 3 husbands, each one dying under suspiciously convenient circumstances. Historians still argue whether she poisoned the second or merely looked the other way while her chamberlain did the deed. But she retained power each time, her lovers replaced like pawns on a board. And her perfume? Allegedly a blend of crushed jasmine and vinegar. Sweet and sharp, even outside Byzantium, the connection between power and passion was unmistakable. At the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, troubadours sang verses that walked the line between piety and eroticism. Your eyes are arrows, one knight declared in a song, and I am pierced gladly. Some of these lyrics were purely poetic. Others were more literal. At least 2 knights were exiled for getting too close to noble ladies, one caught with his boots off under a countess's bed, but Eleanor knew the game. Her court championed the idea of courtly love, where romantic obsession was a noble pursuit, even if officially unconsummated. It gave high-born women influence, emotional leverage in a society that denied them much else. A knight might duel for a glance. A squire might write 20 verses for a lock of hair. Did it sometimes go further? Of course. One Duchess of Champagne had an entire guard rotation reassigned after her chambermaid fell pregnant with the exact shade of the local steward's eyes. The steward was dismissed. The maid was sent to a distant priory. The Duchess? Untouched, because status protected women. Up to a point, the higher you were in the hierarchy, the more you could bend the rules. Queens had affairs. Some were never discovered. Others became full-blown scandals. Take Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England. Their marriage was famously frigid. Edward had a suspiciously close bond with his favorite, Piers Gaveston, a relationship some believe went beyond friendship. Isabella eventually rebelled, taking a lover of her own, Roger Mortimer, and helping orchestrate her husband's downfall. A coup born of both politics and heartbreak. And when Mortimer grew too powerful, her own son had him executed. Thrones, after all, are no place for lingering affections. The court wasn't a safe space for anyone, really. A single rumor could unravel lives. That's why spies were everywhere, disguised as maids, scribes, even musicians. One lute player in Aragon was secretly reporting to the Queen's confessor. His report includes such gems as, "The Lady Ines blushes when Lord Alvar says nothing at all." It's both ridiculous and tragic, because in this world, privacy is a fantasy. Your bed could be bugged with listening servants. Your letters opened. Your sighs misinterpreted. And yet, people still risked everything. One lady-in-waiting to the Queen of Naples had a years-long affair with a falconer. They met at night, beneath the aviary, the smell of feathers and raw meat in the air. She carried a pigeon feather in her bodice as a signal, no feather, no meeting. When they were discovered, she was married off to a minor baron in the far countryside. The falconer vanished, presumed sent away. But their story survives in the margin of a court chronicle, scrawled beside an unrelated trade agreement. She wept at the gates. He did not look back. Sometimes, the stakes were even higher. Illegitimate children could derail inheritance lines. That's why noblewomen were expected to time their trysts carefully, not just around servants or feasts, but around ovulation. Yes, even in the 13th century, there was some understanding of fertility cycles. Midwives whispered it. Older women tracked their bleeding by moonlight. And if timing failed, there were methods. Remember the potion of pennyroyal from earlier? In court life, the recipes were stronger. Ingredients included wild parsley, juniper, even mercury. Dangerous. Sometimes fatal. But to be caught pregnant by the wrong man was worse, and yet, men were rarely punished for fathering bastards, unless the child could claim inheritance. Then suddenly it mattered. Then suddenly, someone was sent riding at midnight to clarify matters with a local priest, which brings us to sexual blackmail. It wasn't just a modern tool. In the 14th century Burgundian court, a chamberlain reportedly seduced a page and then used the threat of exposure to force political favors from the boy's father. The scheme unraveled when the chamberlain's own love letters were discovered, hidden inside a carved statue of St. George. The fallout? 3 dismissals, 1 quiet poisoning, and a stained glass window shattered accidentally during Mass. Even in the Ottoman courts, where different cultural rules applied, sex and politics were deeply entwined. The harem was not just a place of pleasure, it was a political crucible. Concubines could rise to become powerful figures, influencing imperial decisions through whispered counsel. A favored woman might see her son elevated to heir. A rival's fall from grace might begin with nothing more than a rumor, planted carefully, like a seed in the wrong ear. Historians debate how much of this was true intrigue, and how much was mythologized by European visitors obsessed with exoticizing Eastern courts. But what's certain is this: where there is power, intimacy becomes currency. You don't have to look far to find more examples. A young knight promised to a widow, only to be poisoned on his wedding night by the king, who had other plans for the bride. A maid caught eavesdropping on her mistress's pillow talk, then sent to a nunnery with her tongue partially cut, a practice rare, but recorded in court punishment logs. A duke whose secret lover turned out to be a disguised political assassin. Yes, really, because in these palaces, where gold leaf crusted the walls and peacocks strutted across courtyards, every affair was a potential threat. A royal mistress wasn't just a companion, she could be a spy. A nobleman's secret lover could become a rival's informant, and yet, people still kept falling into each other's arms. Because even when sex is risky, forbidden, weaponized, it's still human. Still warm. Still tempting. There are lighter stories, too. One from the court of Navarre tells of a nobleman who faked an ankle injury just to be carried to the queen's physician, so he could see the queen herself, even briefly. When asked if the ruse was worth it, he allegedly replied, "I would limp forever to see her blush again." Another tale, probably apocryphal but still delightful, tells of a lord who tried to seduce a lady with a 1,000-line poem, only to find she'd fallen for the scribe who copied it. He challenged the scribe to a duel. The scribe declined politely and married the lady instead, because sometimes, love wins. Even in the shadows, you linger now in the echo of laughter in a corridor. Your footfalls quiet on inlaid tiles. A fig lies half-eaten on a silver tray. Someone is singing faintly upstairs, off-key, but honest. And across the courtyard, a curtain stirs, you don't know who's behind it. A duchess? A page? A lover, but you know this, they're watching, because at court, someone always is. Because at court, someone always is, sometimes it's just the steward, counting linens. Other times it's the queen herself, watching you from behind a veil, deciding whether you'll become useful, or dangerous, and still, despite all the eyes, all the risks, all the ruined reputations and whispered threats, desire doesn't die, it transforms, it becomes a glance held half a second too long in the torchlight. A coded note left in a fruit bowl. A shared song played out of tune, because only two people know what it really means. It becomes a risk taken at midnight, when even the guards pretend to sleep. Not all these liaisons end in scandal. Some become alliances. Some fade into memory. Some are remembered only through the embroidery left behind in a cushion, the faint trace of perfume on a winter cloak, and some are never spoken of again, but if you press your ear to the palace wall and wait, you might still hear them. The sigh behind the stone. The giggle muffled by tapestries. The hush that isn't silence, but secrecy, because in every royal hall, beyond the marble and power, sex was never just about pleasure. It was language. Leverage. Longing, and someone, somewhere, is still listening. There's mud on your shoes. Again, this time, the road is not lined with marble or incense, but churned into wet ribbons by hooves, carts, and barefoot pilgrims. You're in a village now, somewhere between a castle and a chapel, where the houses are wattle and daub, and the roofs shed more smoke than rain. This is where most medieval people lived, not in courts. Not in cloisters, but in villages, surrounded by fields, gossip, and a half-dozen chickens who never quite stay penned in, and here, sex is different. It's not embroidered with romance or elevated by poetry. It's practical. Messy. Earthy. It smells like sweat and straw and unfinished chores. It happens behind hedges, under carts. Sometimes in haylofts that aren't quite as private as people think, and you're not exempt. You've got a shared bed with your family, a curtain that doesn't fully close, and a neighbor with an uncanny talent for showing up just as you're thinking of someone else's mouth. You're trying to live a decent life. But between the alehouse, the harvest feasts, and the sudden warmth of bodies when the weather turns, desire doesn't exactly hibernate. Let's start with the basics. Marriage. For most peasants, marriage wasn't just a romantic ideal. It was a contract, a way to consolidate labor, land, and lineage. Families arranged matches. The church tried to oversee them. But often, people made their own choices. Especially in tight-knit villages where everyone knew who had how many pigs, and which sons could actually swing a scythe, formal weddings required a priest, a witness, and sometimes a small coin exchange. But many unions happened informally, with something called handfasting, a verbal promise, often in front of neighbors, followed by cohabitation. If you lived together and acted like a married couple, you basically were one. At least until the church said otherwise, and sex, well, it was expected. Not just for pleasure, but for reproduction. More mouths meant more labor. More children meant a future. Even if half of them wouldn't survive the winter, but before marriage, things got more complicated. Premarital sex was technically frowned upon, especially by the church. But in practice, it happened all the time. There was a curious custom in parts of medieval Europe called bundling, where an engaged couple could sleep together, sometimes literally tied up in cloth or separated by a wooden plank, to get to know each other without sinning. In theory, no touching. In reality, well, that depends on the parish priest. In some villages, trial marriages were informally accepted. A couple would live together for a year. If the woman became pregnant, the man was expected to marry her. If not, they might part ways. It wasn't legal, exactly. But it happened often enough that local lords and clerics developed whole sets of rules about it. Of course, not everyone played fair. There's a village record from 14th century Flanders where a man named Thomas promised to marry a woman named Isabeau after harvest. He got her pregnant. Then, surprise, he married someone else. Isabeau's family dragged him to the local bishop. The court ordered him to either pay a dowry or spend a month in public penance, barefoot and in a sackcloth, with fornicator stitched on the back. He chose the sackcloth. Pregnancy outside marriage wasn't uncommon. But it carried risk, social, economic, physical. Some women were forced into marriages. Others were cast out. A few turned to abortion herbs, rue, pennyroyal, or tansy, risking not only their own health but accusations of witchcraft. Because when a woman bled at the wrong time, people started whispering, yet for all the risk, desire persisted. Sometimes it bloomed awkwardly in barns and behind taverns. Other times it became long-term affairs, quiet partnerships never formalized by the church, but accepted by the village, and sometimes it turned dark. In medieval rural areas, consent was not always respected. Assaults occurred. The laws were vague. Victims were often blamed. And the outcomes could be brutal. A woman might be married off to her attacker to restore honor, or worse, accused of leading him on. Justice was inconsistent, and the power imbalance was vast, especially between lords and peasant women, but the village wasn't just a place of hardship. It was also a place of humor, flirtation, and resilience. You'd be surprised how much bawdy humor wound its way through daily life. Songs about stiff stalks and plump cherries were common at festivals. Carvings in alehouses featured men chasing women, sometimes with exaggerated anatomy, and no one thought twice about laughing at them while drinking. And festivals? Oh, they were a pressure valve. Feast days, especially those tied to fertility or the changing seasons, became unofficial dating events. May Day dances, solstice bonfires, and harvest fairs often gave young people rare chances to mingle, touch, and test boundaries under the guise of celebration. There's even a phrase found in multiple regions: "She was taken in the greenwood." A poetic way of saying a couple disappeared into the trees during festival night. Sometimes, they returned engaged. Sometimes not, and despite the church's efforts, superstition often trumped doctrine when it came to sex and reproduction. Many villagers believed in love spells. A woman might bury a man's hair under his threshold. A man might drink water in which a girl had washed her hands, to catch her warmth. Some thought eating eggs during sex made babies more likely. Others swore that placing a knife under the bed cut away infertility. You'd think the clergy would stamp this out. But many priests turned a blind eye, or even dabbled themselves, because yes, rural priests weren't always paragons of chastity. Many kept mistresses. Some fathered children. Others were shockingly open about it. One French village priest in the 15th century referred to his housekeeper as Madame, and his daughter as Little Sin. The villagers shrugged. As long as he gave good sermons and didn't raise taxes, no one much cared. Sometimes, these housekeepers were widows or poor girls, taken in for companionship and protection, in a world that offered few options to unmarried women. The line between charity and exploitation was fuzzy, but let's talk about those women, because peasant women weren't just victims or caretakers. Many had a startling degree of agency, especially compared to their noble counterparts. They chose partners, managed households, bartered goods, handled childbirth. Some ran alehouses or served as midwives, holding deep knowledge of herbs, healing, and reproductive health passed down through generations. Some of them knew more about sex than the priests did. Of course, that power made them dangerous. Accusations of witchcraft often centered on women with too much autonomy, especially if they were unmarried, childless, or simply didn't conform. A midwife who knew how to end a pregnancy. A widow who refused remarriage. A woman with too many cats and not enough deference. That's how a wise woman became a sorceress. Even the tools of pleasure weren't off limits. Archaeologists have found wooden phallic charms carved into beams or worn on belts, sometimes for fertility, sometimes as protection against the evil eye. One was discovered near a village well, carefully wrapped in linen, as if someone had tried to hide it but couldn't quite bear to throw it away. And not all village desire was heterosexual, though deeply taboo. There's evidence that same-sex relationships existed, sometimes expressed in coded letters, sometimes in folk tales. One story from Bohemia tells of two women who lived as sisters for 20 years, sharing a home and reputation for herbal wisdom. They were buried side by side. Their tomb bore no husbands' names. Historians debate whether they were lovers, companions, or simply economic partners, but the villagers called them the quiet wives. Even among men, camaraderie sometimes crossed into something more. A case from 14th century England mentions two laborers caught in an embrace deemed unholy behind a mill. They were fined, not tortured or executed, which was rare leniency. The judge noted they were young and prone to foolishness. One later married. The other vanished from records. So much of this life is unwritten. So much gets lost in fields and fires and time. But if you look closely at the village hearths, the scratched wood, the bundled herbs, there's a tapestry of hidden longing. Of bodies curled together for warmth. Of fingers brushing during chores. Of hearts trying, against all odds, to make something beautiful in a world that rarely paused to notice. You stand in the middle of the village square now. Behind you, someone is sweeping. Ahead, a couple bickers, lightly, over who gets the last dried figure. Children run past, laughing, utterly unaware of the world's harshness. For now, and in the distance, a bell tolls. Not a call to prayer, just a signal that the market's closing, and maybe, just maybe, that someone's waiting in the hayloft again. The sound that wakes you this time isn't birdsong or temple bells. It's a fountain, stone-lipped and marble-lined, whispering in the dark like a secret that's been waiting all night to be told. You're in Baghdad, at the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the city hums even before the sun climbs past the rooftops. Traders unroll carpets. Fruit vendors chant about figs and pomegranates. Somewhere, a call to prayer lifts into the morning haze like steam from hot tea, and for once, you're not here to be shocked. You're here to be curious, because in this golden age of Islamic science, poetry, and medicine, sex isn't hidden behind monastery doors or whispered shame. It's discussed, catalogued, argued over, even, gasp, illustrated. This is a world where scholars debate pleasure alongside theology, and calligraphers ink advice manuals with the same pens used for astronomy. Welcome to a place where sex was studied. You wander into a bookshop near the Copper Market, where the shelves are dense with scrolls and manuscripts. Titles beckon in looping Arabic script: The Perfumed Garden, The Book of Choice Position, on the usefulness of the kiss. You're not dreaming, this is real, and no, it's not pornography. It's literature, science, instruction. Take Al-Nafzawi's The Perfumed Garden. written in the 15th century but rooted in centuries of earlier Arab scholarship. Part sex manual, part moral treatise, it includes discussions of anatomy, foreplay, preferred positions, and even aphrodisiacs. One passage gently advises, the woman's delight lies in the prelude, not the act. Yes, really. That's from the 1400s, you flip through the pages, metaphorically, of course, and you're struck by the tone. It's not crass. It's respectful. It treats sex as natural, mutual, even sacred, when practiced in love, within marriage, and with due consideration for both partners, because here, sex is part of a well-lived life. Islamic teachings, rooted in the Quran and Hadiths, generally affirmed the goodness of marital pleasure. Unlike certain Christian doctrines that saw sex as tainted by sin even within wedlock, many Islamic scholars viewed it as a gift from God, a means of bonding, joy, and family, but of course, that didn't mean anything went, there were rules. Boundaries. Contexts, for example, sex outside marriage, zina, was considered a major sin and could carry serious penalties. But enforcement varied by time, region, and status. Wealthy men might escape judgment. Poor women might suffer greatly. And, as always, people found ways around the rules, sometimes through secrecy, sometimes through scholarship. Let's talk about the erotic sciences. Yes, that was a real phrase. Within certain circles, scholars compile texts not only on sexual technique but on compatibility, timing, and mood. They believed that understanding the body, its humors, rhythms, desires, was key to personal health and social harmony. One treatise divided lovers into types: fiery, airy, earthy, and watery. Another explored the best positions based on astrological signs. If you're a Pisces, apparently, avoid anything too sudden, and then there were perfumes, crafted not just to please the nose but to arouse the body. Musk, ambergris, rose, civet. Men and women anointed themselves carefully before intimate encounters. Some even burned specific woods to scent the air, believing certain aromas awakened passion while others calmed the nerves. Of course, these texts weren't just for scholars, they were copied by midwives, passed between households, and memorized by storytellers. Because storytelling was key, in Baghdad's teahouses, you might hear tales of lovers outwitting jealous husbands, or of wise women dispensing counsel to nervous brides. One popular figure was the fictional Sheikh Nefsawi, who dispensed worldly advice in flowery language: if the date be sweet, do not rush the chew. It's cheeky. But the message? Respect the process. The wedding night was especially ritualized, brides bathed in scented oils. Husbands were advised to be gentle, not aggressive. One manual even suggested beginning with poetry, ideally, composed by the groom himself. If that failed, there were backup options: recite Rumi. Or just make her laugh. Humor, according to one 13th century scribe, opens the door faster than the hand. But the most fascinating part, women's voices were not erased. Yes, the society was patriarchal. Yes, there were strict gender roles. But women composed poetry. They practiced medicine. They authored some of these texts. Take Walida bint al-Mustakfi, a poet princess of Córdoba, still under Islamic rule in the early Middle Ages, who once wrote, "I am made for greatness. My cheeks are like roses, kiss them not in haste, lest you forget the taste." That line was found stitched in gold on her robe. She wasn't shy, neither were the many midwives who recorded their knowledge in handwritten manuals, describing everything from contraceptive techniques to the symptoms of arousal. One listed 12 signs to look for in a woman's body to determine if she was ready for intimacy. Another offered recipes for calming nerves on the first night: warm milk, cardamom, and a whisper of clove. Even the medical texts tackled the topic. Avicenna, Ibn Sina, one of the most influential physicians of the medieval world, included chapters on sexual health in the canon of medicine. He discussed impotence, libido fluctuations, and even sexual satisfaction, treating them as valid components of wellness. That's right, sexual dysfunction wasn't a moral failing. It was a treatable condition. There were tonics, massages, dietary recommendations. Honey with almonds was a common remedy. And if none of that worked, spiritual reflection. Not shame. Imagine how revolutionary that feels. Even now, of course, not everyone approved of all this openness. Some conservative scholars pushed back, especially as politics shifted and orthodox movements gained strength. Books were banned. Erotic art was destroyed. But for several golden centuries, the world of the Abbasids, and their neighbors in Andalusia, Persia, and beyond, embraced a holistic view of human intimacy, and it wasn't all heteronormative. While official doctrine forbade same-sex acts, especially among men, historical records tell a Messier story. Some poems clearly express male-male desire. Others hint at lesbian affection. A few court cases even document long-term same-sex partnerships, sometimes tolerated, sometimes punished, always layered in complexity. In one Andalusian chronicle, a male scribe refers to his companion of the inkstand, with whom he shared 20 winters and 1,000 cups of tea. Were they lovers? Roommates? Both? Historians still argue, and then there's the art. You find it in the margins of manuscripts, in ceramics, even in architecture, not explicit, not vulgar, but sensuous, bodies curved like calligraphy, lovers framed by fountains, a kiss captured mid-motion, as if the artist feared being interrupted but painted it anyway, because in this culture, beauty was sacred, and the body, when treated with honor, could be beautiful. You walk now through a garden, yes, an actual garden, not just a metaphor. Courtyards were central to medieval Islamic homes. Private, lush, fragrant. A space for reflection, prayer, and, sometimes, tenderness. One Abbasid writer described the perfect night as a moonlit courtyard, rose water chilled in a brass basin, and the rustle of silk as she sits beside me. No drama. No conquest, just presence. Intimacy wasn't always about climax. Sometimes, it was about quiet proximity, the sound of someone else breathing, the weight of a hand on a shoulder, the soft sting of laughter between lovers. Even in a society with strict gender norms and sexual codes, people found their ways to each other. They wrote letters, sent embroidered gifts, left poems inside fruit baskets. Some noblewomen installed hidden doors between chambers. Some scholars took pupils who became more than students. The rules were clear, but the heart, and the body, always found space to wander. You sit now on a carved bench beneath a fig tree. The call to prayer echoes again, this time from a distant minaret. A cat winds around your legs. And from a balcony overhead, someone plays a reed flute, soft, uncertain, lovely. You don't know who they're playing for, but you suspect it's someone waiting on the other side of the garden, and you wonder, quietly, how much of history was whispered in courtyards just like this one, too tender for scrolls, too fleeting for sermons, but real all the same. Too tender for scrolls, too fleeting for sermons, but real all the same. The scent of jasmine thickens as the sky darkens, and the stars blink slowly into place, like careful scribes returning to their celestial work. The city doesn't fall silent. It softens. A cellar's bell rings one last time. A lover's sandal brushes stone. A parrot in a high window mimics a giggle it probably wasn't meant to hear. You sit still, half in shadow, watching the city exhale, because in Baghdad, like in so many medieval cities, love wasn't always loud. It was often quiet, coded, and fiercely private. But that didn't make it any less profound. Maybe it was just the meeting of fingertips as a tea bowl passed between them. Or a phrase like, "Come in peace," spoken with eyes that meant, "Stay." Maybe that's the real story, hidden behind all the manuals and edicts and aphrodisiac recipes. Not just how people touched each other, but how they saw each other, as more than roles, as more than law, as bodies that desired, as souls that hoped, and in this city of gardens and scholars and scrolls, someone is always writing about it. Even if no one signs their name. You're blinking through smoke, wood smoke, mostly, but there's also something else in the air tonight. Spiced meat. Incense. The sharp flick of a scented oil. It doesn't matter. Your eyes adjust, and the walls around you come into view, wide, warm, and throbbing with music. You're in a brothel, not the filthy alleyway kind you might imagine. This is the medieval version of nice. Candles burn clean, the tapestries are surprisingly tasteful, and the floor's been swept, recently, even. A woman in a red linen gown glances at you. Not seductively. Not nervously. Just. Professionally. Because here, sex is a business, and business is brisk, contrary to the prudish reputation of the Middle Ages. Prostitution was everywhere, not hidden away, but part of the urban landscape. From Paris to Prague, Cairo to Canterbury, there were entire districts set aside for it. Streets with names like Gropekunt Lane. Yes, that was real. They carved it into signs, because sex work, while often morally condemned, was practically tolerated. Municipal governments knew it existed. Rather than try to eliminate it, they tried to regulate it. Licensed brothels paid taxes. Some cities even owned them. In 14th century London, the Bishop of Winchester ran a whole network of them. His prostitutes were called Winchester geese. The church profiting from sex work. Ironic, yes. But not rare. You step farther in. A lute player strums in the corner. The air is thick with lavender, sweat, and stale wine. Two men bicker in Latin over the price of a kiss. A woman rolls her eyes and lights another candle. Business as usual, but this isn't just a place for coin and carnal exchange, it's a hub of survival. Of stories. Of resistance. Let's meet the women. Most sex workers in medieval Europe were not enslaved. They were free, but often desperately poor. Widows. Abandoned wives. Girls from villages who came to the city and found no other means to pay for bread. Some worked alone. Others operated in pairs or small collectives. Many rented rooms above taverns. A few struck deals with tavern owners, free lodging in exchange for drawing in thirsty customers, but in regulated brothels, things were more formal. Women were expected to register. They had set working hours. In some cities, they were required to wear specific clothing, like yellow hoods or striped belts, so they could be identified in public. It backfired. Some non-prostitutes began wearing the same thing to signal sexual openness. You can imagine the confusion. Still, brothels offered a kind of community. There was protection. Shared meals. Rotating bed sheets. A woman named Isabetta might see 10 clients a night, but she'd go home with enough coin to feed herself. Pay her fees, and still tuck away a few pennies for her child's boots, and yes, many had children. Sex workers were mothers, daughters, and sisters. They laughed. They got bored. They shared hairbrushes. One even wrote poetry. A surviving stanza, scratched into the inside of a wooden cupboard: I sleep with a dozen and dream of one, he does not pay, so I pretend he's gone. Historians still debate whether that was satire or heartbreak. And then there were the clients, not just drunkards and thieves, though there were plenty of those, but merchants, clergy, knights, even minor nobles. For them, brothels were a kind of social pressure valve. A place to indulge desire without the entanglements of courtship or marriage. But even here, rules applied. Most brothels banned clergy in official clothing. Some wouldn't admit anyone under 21. Others closed on holy days. Enforcement. Inconsistent. There's a record from Avignon of a bishop caught in bed with not one but 3 brothel workers. He claimed he was ministering to the fallen. They claimed he brought wine and forgot the sermon, you can guess who was punished. Hint, not the bishop. Still, these women knew how to work the room. Many brothels had house rules, posted or memorized. No violence. No theft. No loitering. Some madams allowed loyalty discounts. A few kept ledgers with precise details. Client number 19, Tuesday, liked feet. Paid 2 florins. Tipped. In larger cities, elite brothels offered specialties, dancers, musicians, multilingual conversation. One Parisian house advertised Greek and Latin delights, though whether that referred to languages or positions is anyone's guess, and while many women entered the trade out of desperation, some became extremely successful. A woman named Agnes Lagodin ran a brothel in 14th century Rouen so well that she retired early and bought a vineyard. Her will listed 7 feather beds, 12 silver spoons, and a prayer bench. A sex worker who donated to churches. Unthinkable to some. Commonplace back then, others weren't as lucky. For every Agnes, there was a Mariette who caught the pox, or a Laura who was beaten and never quite recovered, or a Johanna who disappeared after a nobleman's visit and was never seen again. Brothel life could be brutal, especially when morality turned political, because every few decades, reformers rose up. City councils closed brothels. Preachers thundered. Prostitutes were driven out, or worse, forced to stand in church in nothing but a shift, while the congregation spat. Then, a few years later, guess what? The brothels reopened. Because the demand never stopped. And society needed scapegoats, which brings us to double standards. A man visiting a brothel might be called foolish or weak, but rarely sinful. A woman? She was ruined. Even if she left, married, bore children, became devout, the past clung to her like stale perfume. Some tried to start over. One woman in Venice entered a convent after 15 years in sex work. She kept her name, Constanza. She embroidered altar cloths and led prayers. But on Sundays, she sat in the back. The townspeople never let her forget, others embraced their past. A former courtesan in Milan gave lectures, yes, actual public lectures, on love, power, and female wit. She wore scarlet robes and quoted Ovid. Her nickname? La Donna Senza Vergogna. The woman without shame. You like her already, but let's not forget that not all sex work was chosen. Some women were forced, by poverty, by guardians, even by abduction. In port cities, slave trafficking blended into brothel life. Girls as young as 12 were bought, sold, and broken in. Laws existed to stop this. They were rarely enforced, and for those enslaved or coerced, there were few exits, unless a client fell in love. Or a priest intervened. Or a fire broke out and someone simply ran. Barefoot, into the dark, even in brothels, love found its way in. A client returns each week, never asking for sex. He brings oranges, says little. One day, he offers marriage. She laughs, hard. He says he'll wait. She says she's not the waiting kind. He leaves anyway. 10 years later, she receives a carved comb in the mail. No name. But it's her favorite kind, wooden, with a silver tooth. Historians still debate whether that's a romantic gesture or a bad hair joke. And what about male sex workers? They existed. They were fewer, less organized, and even more stigmatized. Most worked unofficially, serving women, sometimes men. A 15th century Florence trial record describes a boy of delicate face offering his services to nobles. He was fined for indecent exposure, but not arrested. The judge wrote, "He pleads hunger." I believe him. Even rarer were transgender individuals, but they too appear in the records, usually as cautionary tales, scandalous anecdotes, or objects of fascination. A former courtesan in Milan gave lectures, yes, actual public lectures, on love, power, and female wit. She wore scarlet robes and quoted Ovid. Her nickname? La Donna Senza Vergogna. The woman without shame. You like her already, but let's not forget that not all sex work was chosen. Some women were forced, by poverty, by guardians, even by abduction. In port cities, slave trafficking blended into brothel life. Girls as young as 12 were bought, sold, and broken in. Laws existed to stop this. They were rarely enforced, and for those enslaved or coerced, there were few exits, unless a client fell in love. Or a priest intervened. Or a fire broke out and someone simply ran, barefoot, into the dark. Even in brothels, love found its way in. A client returns each week, never asking for sex. He brings oranges, says little. One day, he offers marriage. She laughs, hard. He says he'll wait. She says she's not the waiting kind. He leaves anyway. 10 years later. She receives a carved comb in the mail. No name. But it's her favorite kind, wooden, with a silver tooth. Historians still debate whether that's a romantic gesture or a bad hair joke. And what about male sex workers? They existed. They were fewer, less organized, and even more stigmatized. Most worked unofficially, serving women, sometimes men. A 15th-century Florence trial record describes a boy of delicate face offering his services to nobles. He was fined for indecent exposure, but not arrested. The judge wrote, "He pleads hunger." I believe him. Even rarer were transgender individuals, but they too appear in the records, usually as cautionary tales, scandalous anecdotes, or objects of fascination. One story from Toledo describes a person named Andreas, born male, who lived as a woman, worked in a brothel, and was discovered only upon death. The physician declared it a miracle. The priest called it demonic deception. But the brothel workers wept. They said Andreas told the best jokes. You walk through the brothel now, past velvet drapes and candle-streaked mirrors. Someone sings softly, off-key, but honest. A woman plucks a lute string, then sighs and sets it down. Another combs her hair and eyes the window. A client knocks and is told to wait, because even here, there's ceremony. Sex may be transactional. But dignity? That's earned, and surprisingly often, it's claimed. One worker paints her lips with crushed berries. Another resews a bodice torn by a clumsy client. Another counts her coins with the precision of a tax clerk. These women know their trade. They know their value, and they know what it means to be seen, not just touched. Some still pray. Some don't. Some cry when the candles go out. Some hum lullabies for the child sleeping in the next room. Some dream of escape. Others of staying, because for all its contradictions, hypocrisies, and cruelties, the medieval brothel was more than a den of vice. It was a workplace, a hiding place, a kind of home. And you, just passing through, can feel it in the floorboards. Not just the footsteps, but the stories etched between them. You leave quietly, not because you're ashamed, but because you've learned something, that behind every closed curtain is a person, and behind every body, a name. You are lying on your side, on a creaky straw pallet in a stone room barely wider than your arms can stretch. The shutters are bolted. The torch has guttered out. And above you, through a slit in the ceiling, faint candlelight spills downward, casting a long cross-shaped shadow across the floor. You're in a convent, and someone upstairs is moaning, not from pain. Not from prayer, from something much, much messier. It turns out that medieval celibacy vows weren't as watertight as the church hoped. And inside these cloisters of supposed purity, where sex was forbidden, temptation was to be overcome, and the soul was meant to triumph over the flesh. Desire didn't vanish, it adapted. Let's talk about the religious life. Monks, nuns, and everyone in between. You probably imagine ascetic silence, brown robes, hours of Gregorian chants, a bowl of lentils, and never once thinking about thighs. But the truth? Even in the most holy communities, people were still people. Take nuns, for instance. Women entered convents for many reasons: spiritual calling, family pressure, lack of dowry, or a desire to escape marriage. Some were deeply devout. Others just didn't want to be someone's eighth wife. And inside these stone sanctuaries, often hidden from public eyes, a parallel world unfolded, full of sisterhood, yes, but also frustration, longing, and sometimes even romance. There are records, many, actually, of nuns engaging in intimate relationships. With visiting priests. With confessors. With each other. A 14th-century abbess in Poitiers wrote in her diary, which she kept hidden beneath a statue of Saint Catherine, "The silence between prayers grows heavy with breath." She never named names. But she did draw a small heart beside the passage. Other records are less subtle. In Saxony, an entire convent was investigated after multiple villagers reported seeing nuns sneaking out after Compline, often barefoot, carrying wine jugs, and returning at dawn. The bishop who arrived to inspect found several of them tipsy, a few pregnant, and one in bed with a stable boy. The convent was shut down, but it wasn't just rural outposts. Even elite convents, filled with noble daughters, saw their fair share of scandal. In 15th-century Milan, a nun named Sister Benedetta kept a detailed set of letters from her lover, a bishop's secretary, whom she referred to as "my daily psalm." Historians still argue whether these letters were ever delivered, or just written to ease loneliness. And then there are the monks. If the nuns had confined whispers and hidden scrolls, the monks had whole libraries, some of which were a little, shall we say, unorthodox. Within the margins of illuminated manuscripts, yes, even those lovingly copied by devout hands, one finds doodles. Curious doodles. Doodles of monks chasing women. Of monks spanking each other with psalters. Of phallic creatures on stilts and men with their heads up skirts. Historians call them grotesques. But you get the feeling someone was having fun. Behind the walls of monasteries, young men took vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity. But they also scrubbed each other's backs in the bathhouse. They shared sleeping quarters. They confessed sins that got oddly repetitive, and sometimes, the temptation proved too much. A monk named Johannes of Hildesheim wrote in his personal journal, "I dream again of Brother Anselm's hands. I rise at matins cold, and not from the weather." The journal was never meant to be read. But it was kept, carefully folded in a cabinet beneath volumes of theology, because the abbey knew, and while not every monastery condoned such closeness, few were free from it entirely. There's a strange contradiction in medieval religious life. Intimacy was denied, yet proximity was constant. People slept in rows. Bathed in groups. Prayed side by side. Shared meals, chores, confessions. In this closeness, bonds deepened. And sometimes, they crossed lines. Now, not every connection was sexual. Many were just that, intense friendships, forged through solitude, shared belief, and longing for something beyond the material world. But sometimes, spiritual devotion became indistinguishable from emotional obsession. Take the letters of Saint Elred of Rievaulx, a 12th-century English abbot. He wrote extensively on spiritual friendship, often with language so lush, so tender, that later readers questioned whether it veiled erotic subtext. He called one monk "my other self," and wrote, "Our souls blend as wine and water." Were they just friends? Or something more? The Church declared the writing holy. Historians still argue. Let's not forget confessionals. On paper, a sacred practice. A moment of unburdening. In practice, a deeply intimate exchange, often one-on-one, behind screens or in corners of chapels, where a vulnerable person spilled the darkest parts of their soul to someone with power, anonymity, and, for many priests, barely restrained curiosity. Confessors heard everything: carnal dreams, forbidden fantasies, accidental touches, deliberate ones, and in some cases, they acted on them. There's a 14th-century report from Normandy of a priest who counseled a nun over 6 consecutive weeks. Each time, probing her soul and body for sin. When discovered, he claimed he was exorcising her lust. She claimed she had none until he taught her how to feel it. He was defrocked, she was sent to a harsher convent. Even in more virtuous environments, there were contradictions. Medieval religious texts often described the body in florid, sensual terms, even when condemning it. One mystic wrote, "The soul trembles like a bride unclothing herself before God." Another spoke of divine union as a kiss beneath the ribs. The language of the divine and the language of desire often mirrored each other. It's no wonder that visions of saints sometimes included bodily ecstasy, moans, tears, tremors. Saint Teresa of Avila famously described an angel piercing her with a flaming spear, leaving her utterly consumed, sweetly wounded, and drenched in divine pain. She was canonized, but everyone reading that passage raised at least one eyebrow. Even asceticism itself, fasting, self-flagellation, mortifying the flesh, had an undeniable physicality. Some historians argue it was a way to channel sexual energy into devotion. Others think it was sublimation gone haywire. Either way, the boundaries blurred. Some saints claimed to smell roses during visions. Others described heat, light, and the sensation of being held. A few left diaries filled with coded longing, for God, yes, but with a familiarity that felt almost romantic. In a world that discouraged physical intimacy, some found spiritual loopholes. You walk now through the convent garden, low hedges, a trickling well, vines clinging to stone walls. A novice kneels in prayer beside the rosemary bush. You hear her whisper, not words of doctrine, but something like a name. The garden is walled, but not quiet, because here's the truth, even behind the veil of devotion, desire breathes. Softly. Carefully. But relentlessly. Some resisted it. Some embraced it. Some transformed it into prayer, and some were simply caught between vows and hearts, between the sacred and the urgent. Take Sister Ulrika of Mainz, who wrote in a late-night letter, "I have confessed my body as sin, but it still wakes before my soul does." She later burned the letter. But someone saved the ashes, and this wasn't unique to Christianity. In Buddhist monasteries across East and Southeast Asia, monks and nuns also took vows of chastity. And yet, court records, temple archives, and private letters describe instances of sexual relationships between monks and lay people, monks and monks, even teachers and disciples. One temple in Japan was infamous for harboring beautiful boys, kept for the pleasure of high-ranking monks. A scandal erupted. A few resignations followed. But the practice, according to multiple scholars, persisted for generations, and in Tibetan records, there's a phrase used discreetly among monks, "the mountain stirs." A coded way of saying someone had a restless night. In every tradition, desire found cracks in the stone, because it wasn't always about rebellion. Sometimes, it was about connection. In an isolated world, a hand that lingered half a second longer during morning chores could be the only tenderness someone knew for months, and in the silence of night, when prayers were done and the world was still, a warm shoulder shared in secret might feel like the holiest thing of all. You walk back inside now. The chapel is dark, but not empty. You hear soft footsteps. A breath caught mid-prayer. The flutter of a page being turned too quickly, a candle flickers, a woman's shadow brushes yours. She doesn't speak, neither do you, and in that shared silence, bound by stone, but not by shame, you understand. They weren't saints, they were seekers, and the line between the two, always thinner than the scripture suggested. You are moving through velvet shadows now. Rich ones. Heavy with perfume and laughter. Somewhere above you, colored glass throws soft petals of red and gold across the tiled floor. Silk slippers scuff softly behind a curtain. A woman coughs delicately into a fan. You're in medieval China, in a pleasure quarter. A place called the greenhouses. And no, they don't sell plants, they sell illusion, because here, sex isn't shameful or chaotic. It's an art form. Regulated, refined, almost ritualized. And what you're about to learn might surprise you. In many East Asian cultures of the medieval period, intimacy was treated as something you could study, perfect, and even elevate, but don't rush ahead. First, you need to let go of some assumptions. These women, they're not prostitutes in the way your Western textbooks might suggest. They're courtesans, and their value isn't measured in time spent naked. It's measured in poetry, performance, etiquette, and emotional dexterity. To be invited into a greenhouse isn't like stumbling into a brothel. It's more like being granted audience. You're expected to be polite, literate, witty. Bonus points if you can quote the Tang Dynasty poets, and money. That helps, too. Your host this evening is named Jia. She wears 5 layers of gauze, the outermost barely the color of peach skin, and her hair is looped and pinned with a sprig of jade. She leads you through a series of chambers lit by fish-shaped lanterns, each one gently swaying. You pass musicians tuning pipas, dancers stretching under painted panels, and one woman calmly reading a scroll with a kitten sleeping in her lap. This is not a place of loud transactions, this is a world of controlled fantasy, and it's been here, in one form or another, for centuries. Let's rewind. In Tang Dynasty China, 618 to 907 CE, the capital city of Chang'an had entire districts devoted to entertainment, music, and sensuality. These were places where high-status courtesans could read and write, compose songs, debate philosophy, and, yes, have sex, but only if they chose to. They were trained not just in lovemaking, but in literary charm, calligraphy, tea ceremony, and the extremely subtle art of making a man feel like he was cleverer than he was. It was emotional theater, and they were the leading ladies. Sex itself, that was often secondary. Some clients visited the same courtesan for months without ever sleeping with her. Their goal was to court, to impress, to earn the right to closeness. And sometimes, even when the moment came, it was less physical than you'd imagine. In classical Chinese erotic manuals, yes, there were many. Sex was described not as conquest, but as harmony. Yin and yang. Breath and motion. Inhaling when your partner exhales. Timing your pulse to their rhythm. One guide advised, the tongue is more vital than the loins. Another warned, too quick a finish unbalances the liver. Imagine that in your next health checkup, the body was seen as a landscape of energies, and sex was the art of traveling that landscape with awareness. There were diagrams, seriously. Flow charts. Positions named after birds, rivers, seasons. Nothing crude. All symbolic, and here's the kicker, many of these manuals were read not just by men, but by women, because female desire. Acknowledgeable. Shareable. Valuable. Court ladies, wives of literati, even Buddhist nuns studied these texts, not necessarily for bedroom acrobatics, but for health, beauty, longevity, and relationship maintenance. Yes, even monastic communities saw sexual energy as something that could be transmuted, not just repressed. You sit now across from Jia as tea is poured. She doesn't rush. 3 pours, 1 swirl, 1 breath. The steam spirals between you like a lazy dragon. Then she speaks. She asks if you've read the Book of the Pillow. You blink. She smiles. That's the nickname for Su Nu Jing, a Taoist sexology classic, presented as a dialogue between the Yellow Emperor and a mysterious woman named Su Nu, who teaches him how to balance his body and prolong life through cultivated intimacy, not debauchery, discipline. Jia tilts her head. Would you like to know the 16 kinds of embrace? You probably would, but not yet. Because first, you're going to walk with her down a hallway where murals stretch across silk-paneled walls, images of couples in slow-motion embrace, surrounded by clouds, cranes, and flowering trees. Every touch seems to bloom rather than grab. The erotic art of medieval China wasn't obscene. It was atmospheric. No naked wrestling. No frantic scenes. Instead, you see fingers brushing a collarbone. A lover whispering into an ear. Feet slipping out of embroidered shoes, it's more suggestion than declaration. More poetry than plot, which brings us to the poets. Men like Li Bai and Bai Ji didn't just drink and write. They wrote about love, lust, longing, and, sometimes, their favorite courtesans. They left behind verse that reads like longing caught on paper. One stanza, written after a brief night with a woman known only as Spring Orchid, your sleeve carried the scent of plum blossoms, I dreamed of it for 4 years. That's one very committed olfactory memory, even emperors fell under the spell. The infamous Emperor Xuanzong became utterly besotted with his consort Yang Guifei, who had been a courtesan. She was said to smell of lotus petals and peaches, and poems describe her as moving like a willow in wind. When rebellion forced him to flee, he took her with him. When the soldiers mutinied, demanding her death, he sobbed and obeyed. It said her hairpin was all he kept. He built a temple later, just to remember her. This wasn't rare. Courtesans weren't always hidden or hated. Sometimes, they shaped culture, they influenced fashion, song, even politics. Some were spies. Some were muses. Some became legends, but not all was elegant silk and philosophical foreplay. In poorer quarters, far from the lanterns and garden pavilions, sex work could be harsh. Young girls were sold into brothels. Contracts bound them for life. Clients were rough, drunk, impatient. These women weren't learning the art of balance, they were just trying to survive, and if they aged, became sick, or rebelled, they were thrown out. Or worse, one anonymous poem, scratched into a temple wall, I sang for men with rice wine breath, now I beg at the same doors, my shoes are gone. My name forgotten, but I still remember every song. History tends to forget those voices. But they're there. Beneath the incense. Behind the folding screens, still, the idea of sex as harmony persisted. In Japan, it took root in the floating world, the ukiyo. A term that originally meant sorrowful impermanence, it came to represent pleasure districts where geisha, oiran, and other entertainers blurred the line between artistry and intimacy. Sex in this context wasn't quick or crude. It was choreographed. Entire books outlined the correct way to approach a courtesan, how to write a letter, how to send a gift, how to wait. Many men never reached the bedchamber. Some didn't even want to, they just wanted to be seen, and to bask, for an hour or two, in the company of someone who made them feel less alone. There's something both beautiful and heartbreaking about that. In Korea, the Kizaeng played a similar role, trained entertainers who mastered dance, poetry, and conversation. Some did become lovers to high-ranking men. But others remained independent, choosing their patrons carefully. A famous one, Huang Jinai, refused to sleep with a scholar until he solved her riddle poem. He failed. She laughed, she died a legend. You leave Jia's greenhouse now, not because she asks you to, but because she walks you to the door, as if this has all been a performance with a scheduled end. You bow. She nods, no coins exchanged, just a look, one that seems to say, this moment mattered. Because in medieval China, and its cultural cousins, sex wasn't just about bodies. It was about balance. About how two people moved through space, time, breath. How they offered themselves not with abandon, but with awareness. Was it always fair? No. Was it always beautiful? Definitely not, but for those who practiced the art, not just of lovemaking, but of presence, it was more than biology, it was intimacy by design, and in a world where much was arranged, coerced, or rushed, that intention. That willingness to slow down, observe, and truly meet another person, it was the most radical thing of all. You take one last breath before stepping into the street. The lantern light fades behind you, but its warmth lingers, caught in the folds of your sleeve, the curve of your neck, the back of your thoughts. Outside, the night is cooler, quieter, but something inside you has shifted, because what you witnessed wasn't a transaction, it was an exchange, not just of touch, but of attention. Of presence. Of breath held between silences, and long after the candles die, that's what endures, not the act, but the memory of being, for a moment, fully seen. You're walking uphill now. Slowly. The cobblestones are uneven, slick from mist, and your breath curls around your face like a question mark. It's not quite dawn, but not full night either. Just that in-between hour when even a fortress can feel like it's holding its breath. Ahead of you, iron gates creak open, you're entering a castle. A real one. Towers, battlements, ramparts, all the fixings. But tonight, you're not here for siegecraft or royal intrigue, you're here to learn what sex was like for the nobility, and yes, behind all the gilded tapestries and dragon-shaped candleholders, the lords and ladies of medieval Europe had desires too. Some of them were whispered under breath. Others were written in letters that no one was supposed to read. Some were captured in betrothal contracts, others in scandalous poems. And a few chiseled into the footnotes of family trees as child born before the banns were read. Let's begin with a tour. The first room you enter is a solar, a kind of private sitting room. There's embroidery left half done on a frame, a lute with one broken string, and a bed behind a thick curtain. Not just a sleeping space, this is where the lady of the house might receive favored guests. Politely. Strategically, possibly sensually, because in noble courts, sex was rarely just about pleasure. It was about property, alliances, diplomacy. And the production of heirs, marriage. Almost always arranged. Often before the bride was old enough to spell her husband's name. These unions were practical. The goal wasn't love. It was land. Or cattle. Or titles, but that didn't mean love, and lust stayed out of the picture, quite the opposite, because once married, noblemen, and sometimes noblewomen, had a whole household of people around them, pages, maids, tutors, squires. Privacy was scarce. But opportunity? Abundant. Let's talk about ladies-in-waiting. On paper, they were attendants, young women sent by noble families to serve queens, duchesses, and high-born ladies. But in reality, they were often caught up in a subtle network of flirting, spying, and courtly attraction. A lady-in-waiting might catch the eye of a visiting count. Or a prince. Or the lady of the castle herself. Relationships bloomed, or exploded, and because no one could just admit what was going on, they invented a language of coded glances and metaphor. Take courtly love poetry, an entire genre dedicated to yearning. Not consummation. Not reality. Just exquisite, prolonged agony. A knight praises his lady's scarf. Her eyes. Her silence. He swears to die in her service. But never to touch her. Because touching would ruin the magic, but let's not kid ourselves, sometimes they touched. One 13th century letter from a noble woman to her knight reads, "You said my glove would keep you warm at night, but I left it in your bed on purpose. Did you find what was inside it?" We'll never know what that was, but whatever it wasn't embroidery thread. Sex among the nobility often followed two tracks, the public and the private. Publicly, nobles were expected to uphold virtue. Modesty. Marital fidelity, for women, at least. But privately, the rules bent. Affairs were rampant, often tacitly accepted, especially when discreet. Men kept mistresses, some even had rooms set aside for them in the castle. These women weren't necessarily lowborn. Some were widows. Some were courtiers. Some were known by name in court records, right alongside the official spouse. One such mistress, Marie of Champagne, was so beloved by her count that he gave her a personal seal and allowed her to issue orders in his absence. His wife was not thrilled. Women, too, occasionally maintained lovers, though it was riskier. A noblewoman caught in adultery could be disgraced, disinherited, or worse. But that didn't stop them. Some used their ladies' chambers as shields. Others slipped out under pretense of prayer. One duchess reportedly disguised her lover as a priest and smuggled him in through the castle's postern gate every Thursday. He eventually grew a real beard to look more monk-like. That beard is still depicted in a tapestry at the abbey he later joined. Regret? Possibly, and while we're talking about regret, let's talk about marital beds. They were big. Wooden. Heavy. Often carved with religious imagery, as if to remind the couple that God was watching. And probably judging. On the wedding night, it was common for the entire household to walk the couple to their chamber. A priest might bless the bed. Musicians played. In some cases, a witness actually stood inside the room, hidden behind a curtain or screen, to confirm consummation, because a marriage without consummation could be annulled. Which meant lost land, lost titles, lost leverage. So yes, there were checklists, but beyond the ceremonial part, most noble couples didn't share a bed regularly. They had separate chambers, separate routines. Sex was scheduled, expected, often awkward, and here's the kicker: manuals existed to guide them. The 15th century Le Livre de Manners, the Book of Manners, recommended that couples sleep apart most of the time to avoid overheating the blood. It suggested sex only on certain days, never on feast days, never during Lent, never on Fridays, and definitely not during thunderstorms, because thunder was believed to interrupt the humoral balance needed for conception. Lightning, apparently, scrambled sperm. Even so, conception was the goal, especially for noblewomen, whose entire value was often tied to fertility. Producing a son wasn't just a blessing, it was a form of political insurance, which meant the pressure was intense, and the blame, if it didn't happen, often fell on her. Some turned to herbs and charms. Others visited midwives for fertility treatments involving everything from steamed baths to powdered deer antler. One noblewoman reportedly slept with a relic, a saint's toenail, beneath her pillow every night for a year. It didn't work, but she claimed it gave her comfort. Pregnancy brought its own complications. Women were often sequestered for months, fed specific diets, and surrounded by only female attendants. Birth was risky, and many noblewomen didn't survive it. But if they did, and bore a son, they were celebrated, for a while, until the husband started eyeing a maid with thicker hair or a softer voice, which brings us to the castle's servants. They were everywhere. And they saw everything. Maids caught between duties often found themselves entangled with masters. Some were coerced. Others, not. A few rose through the ranks by becoming favorites of a lord or lady. There's a recorded case of a scullery maid who became the unofficial consort of a duke. He paid for her education, gave her a wardrobe, and referred to her in letters as "my little sparrow." When his wife died, he married the sparrow. They had 5 children. The nobility was full of double standards. A man could be forgiven for a mistress, a woman. Rarely, a nobleman's illegitimate children might be raised in the household. A noblewoman's. Hidden. Or abandoned, yet through it all, people still found ways to connect, clumsily, carefully, sometimes catastrophically, and sex, while strategic, was also often tender, clumsy, complicated. One duke wrote to his lover, after years apart, "I have taken other women to bed, but none have spoken your name between my shoulder blades." Whatever that means. You feel it, because noble life, for all its riches, was often lonely. Married at 13. Widowed at 20. Married again at 22. Children raised by wet nurses. Lovers who leave when the alliance ends. A lifetime of watching your body be someone else's bargaining chip. Is it any wonder some took refuge in secret romances, and others turned to poetry, or prayer, or letters tucked inside hollow bookcases? You descend now into the castle's storage level. It's cold. Smells like grain and old apples. But here, among the barrels and crates, a wooden chest sits slightly ajar. Inside, letters. Dozens. Maybe hundreds, some from a knight to his lady, your name is the only sword I draw gladly. Some from a maid to a squire, you smell like rain and salt. Stay longer next time. Some unsigned. Just scribbled lines, I want you to knock over my candle. Come through the door near the stables. Tell no one. Ever. You close the lid gently, because this, too, is part of history, not just who slept with whom, but who longed, who waited, who imagined, who risked everything for 1 hour behind a curtain, and as you climb the spiral staircase back toward dawn, you think less about lords and ladies, and more about how desire doesn't follow titles, it follows the human shape of things, the ache, the hope, the candlelit quiet between alliances. You're not sure how you got here. 1 minute, you were leaving the castle before sunrise, feet sore from the weight of other people's secrets, heart a little heavier from the echo of longing trapped in stone walls. Now you're lying on something soft, too soft for a medieval inn. There's incense in the air, sweet and smoky, with just a trace of burnt cedar. Silk rustles near your ear. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes jingle like they're gossiping. You're in a tent. But not just any tent, this is the Mongol Empire, and tonight, the firelight dances on fur, armor, and bare skin. You're in the lands of the Khans now. And when it comes to love, sex, and power in one of history's most mobile empires, the rules are different. Forget stone castles and courtly sighs. Out here, it's horses, yurts, and warriors who believe in pragmatism first, passion second, and property last. Because in Mongol culture, while conquest ruled the battlefield, sexual politics were surprisingly flexible. Let's start with marriage. Genghis Khan himself had several wives, and dozens of concubines. But only one primary wife, Borte, held the highest status. She lived in her own tent, controlled her own livestock, and was the only one whose sons could inherit the throne. The rest? Strategic matches, diplomatic gifts, or war prizes, but unlike in many other empires, these women weren't necessarily silent captives. Some wielded serious power. Genghis's daughters ran cities. His daughters-in-law managed trade routes. And a few even led troops, which is to say, sex in the Mongol Empire wasn't just a male privilege. It was part of a larger strategy, and women played it, too. Now, that's not to say it was all equality and open-minded fun. Captured women, from conquered territories, were often taken as concubines or servants, especially if they were young and exotic by steppe standards. These encounters were usually not consensual, and though they were normalized in Mongol law, their emotional cost was staggering. But among Mongol society itself, especially between equals, sex wasn't shamed. In fact, romantic love was considered secondary to compatibility and usefulness. A good partner was someone who could herd sheep, mend a saddle, birth a child on the go, and boil goat meat while your husband fought a border war. That said, desire wasn't absent, it was just practical. There's a famous folktale from the steppes about a young woman named Ailin Goe, whose husband dies, leaving her with no children. One night, a glowing visitor enters her yurt and lays beside her silently. She conceives 3 sons, including Bodonkar, the legendary ancestor of the Mongol royal line. To this day, scholars debate, was the glowing visitor a god? A neighbor? A political rewrite? Historians still argue whether the myth was crafted to conceal the father's identity, or elevate the children's status. But one thing is clear, sexual mystery was folded into legitimacy, not erased from it. You sit now beside a hearth as a woman combs her hair. She's wearing only boots and a necklace made from copper coins. She's not embarrassed. She doesn't flinch when a man enters and flops down beside her. They're married. But even if they weren't, it wouldn't raise many eyebrows. Premarital sex in Mongol culture was often tolerated. In fact, young women were encouraged to explore their options before settling. A well-documented account by a Chinese ambassador in the Yuan dynasty observed that Mongol girls are not ashamed to run away with a boy they admire. Parents didn't always stop them. As long as no marriage vows had been exchanged and no pregnancies occurred, romantic experimentation was seen as normal. You'd think such laxity would cause chaos, but it didn't. Why? Because Mongol society was structured around honor, lineage, and loyalty, not sexual purity. There were expectations, of course. Infidelity within marriage could cause disputes. But it didn't carry the same doom and gloom stigma as in medieval Europe. A woman caught with a lover might face temporary exile or a fine, not branding, beheading, or cloistering. There's even a record of a noblewoman who left her husband to marry a falconer. The husband appealed to his Khan, who ruled. She chose a man who feeds her. Let her go. Not exactly romantic. But remarkably progressive. Sexuality wasn't a battleground for virtue. It was a means of survival, a way to build ties, to forge kinship, to ensure the continuation of your lineage, and because the Mongol Empire spanned from China to Persia to Russia. The cultural fusion shaped everything, including sex. Persian perfumes met Chinese silk met Slavic lullabies. And in the privacy of yurts lit by pinewood fires, people whispered in more than one language. Some Mongol nobles adopted Persian lovers. Others wrote love poems in Chinese. A few even converted to Islam or Buddhism, reshaping how they understood modesty, marriage, and even desire. You leaf through a letter found in a Mongol princess's chest. It reads, "You ride away before the snow melts, but I will sleep beside your saddle until spring." It's unsigned. Unsent, but someone folded it, carried it, and kept it, because even warriors get lonely, and tenderness wasn't shameful. You walk now to the edge of a camp. Children chase goats in the dust. Women hang blankets on lines strung between wagons. You hear a man singing to his horse, and it's a love song. About a woman who left, and a horse who stayed. You chuckle. But only a little, because Mongol sex wasn't wrapped in fantasy. It was part of daily life. It happened in tents. On travels. Between battles. Sometimes with passion. Sometimes just because the stew was warm, and the night was cold. Even within the military, intimacy was present. Male companions traveled, camped, and fought together, often for years. Some became inseparable. While hard evidence is sparse, oral histories speak of brothers in arms who shared not just duties but affections. One general was said to have refused marriage, claiming, "I have already chosen the man I will die beside." What that meant is unclear. But the story was respected, not ridiculed. Then there were the rituals. In some clans, wedding night customs required the couple to spend 3 days together without leaving the tent. Food was delivered. Visitors were banned. The idea was not just to ensure consummation, but to forge intimacy in isolation, and if conception occurred, all the better. You rest now beside a fire. An elder offers you fermented mare's milk. It's sour. You try not to grimace. He chuckles, and begins to tell you a story, about a man who fell in love with a warrior's wife. Instead of killing him, the warrior invited him to join his family. The wife agreed. The three raised children together, tended livestock, and lived in one yurt until old age. Was it typical? No, but Mongol society, shaped by necessity and nomadic resilience, often allowed for unorthodox solutions. What mattered was survival. Stability. Honor, and sometimes, honor meant letting go of pride. Sex didn't need velvet beds or stained glass shadows. It just needed time. Space. And a culture willing to admit that bodies, and hearts, wander. You leave the camp just as the stars bloom overhead. The wind smells of ash and wool. Somewhere behind you, laughter erupts. A yurt door flaps open. Then closes, and as you walk into the dark, you realize, sex, across centuries, across empires, has always been a tangle of expectation and reality. A negotiation between desire and duty. A dance between who we are and what the world demands, but under every rule, behind every curtain, inside every yurt, palace, or peasant hut, there was always someone reaching out, to be held. To be known. To feel, for just a moment, not alone, and now, with that final ember fading behind you, it's time to lie down, let your muscles unclench. Let your breath slow. You've wandered long enough, across continents, across bedchambers, across time, you made it, you survived medieval sexuality, with your curiosity intact and your dignity only mildly scorched, and now, let the world go quiet, let the stars move unnoticed, let sleep take the place of curiosity, let it hold you, just for tonight, wind down, 300 words, you're lying still now. Nothing moves. Not the fire. Not your thoughts, the stories you've carried, from monasteries and marriage beds, from silk tents and shadowed confessionals, they settle gently beside you. Like folded clothes at the end of a long day, and maybe, just maybe, they remind you that history is not just kings and wars and dates. It's bodies brushing in candlelight. It's lovers whispering promises they can't keep. It's mistakes made under moonlight. It's the ache of loneliness in a room full of people, it's every moment someone reached out, across laws, across fear, across expectation, and said, I want to know you, so breathe, feel the stillness of your own chest, let it rise. Let it fall, you're not chasing anything now, no distant city. No castle window. No silk-wrapped promise, just your own still body, and the echo of 1,000 lives that once lay down the same way. Close your eyes, forget what you've learned, just for now, let the world be soft again, let the past go quiet, let sleep be the only thing left, and when you wake, it will still be with you, but you'll be ready to carry it, lightly as a whisper, good night, sweet dreams.